Trial by ordeal. Forced you to carry red-hot iron. Trial by ordeal stands as one of the most brutal and haunting forms of justice in medieval history, a terrifying ritual that forced accused individuals to face agonizing pain as a divine test of innocence. Among the most feared was the ordeal of carrying red-hot iron, a practice that transformed the court into a chamber of fire and dread, where a person's fate was sealed not by evidence or truth, but by the mysterious will of God, as interpreted through searing flesh and slow healing wounds. Imagine the accused, often desperate, trembling, brought before a crowd in the courtyard or the churchyard. Their crime might range from theft to accusations of witchcraft or murder. There were no lawyers, no forensic experts, only faith and fear. The ritual was simple in concept, but horrifying in execution. A heavy iron bar or rod would be heated in a roaring fire until glowing red-hot, so hot that the metal itself seemed to pulse with the breath of hell. Then, the accused was commanded to grasp the iron and walk a set number of steps, sometimes 3, sometimes more, while holding the burning metal in their bare hands. The crowd watched in grim silence, some praying, some jeering, all waiting for the judgment to come. The pain was immediate and excruciating. Flesh blistered, nerves seared, and skin split under the unbearable heat. The iron burned deep, leaving raw, angry wounds. But the ordeal did not end there. The injured hand or arm was bound tightly, sometimes in a cloth soaked with herbs or wine, and the accused was sent away, often to a monastery or under the watch of priests, to await the verdict of healing. 3 days later, the wounds were examined. If they had begun to heal cleanly, showing signs of healthy tissue and no infection, it was taken as a sign of divine favor. The accused was innocent. But if the wounds festered, turned black, or showed signs of gangrene, the verdict was certain: guilt. The accused was condemned, often executed by hanging, burning, or other gruesome means. The ordeal of red-hot iron was terrifying, not just because of the physical pain, but because it was a test stacked against the accused from the start. Medicine at the time was rudimentary. Infections were common and could develop rapidly, especially in wounds inflicted by molten metal. Healing depended on many factors outside the person's control: their health, the cleanliness of their environment, the skill of the healers, even chance. A guilty person might heal well, and an innocent one might be doomed by a simple infection or bad care. This form of justice was deeply rooted in medieval beliefs about divine intervention. The Church held immense power over law, and it was believed that God would not allow an innocent person to suffer unjustly. The ordeal was thought to reveal God's judgment directly, cutting through lies and deceit in a way human courts could not. But in practice, it became a tool of fear and oppression, often used to reinforce the power of local lords or the Church itself, to punish the powerless, and to uphold social order through terror. Trials by ordeal, like carrying red-hot iron, faded over time, especially as legal systems developed more rational procedures, and as skepticism about supernatural justice grew during the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. Yet their legacy remains, a chilling reminder of a time when pain was law, faith was evidence, and survival was often a cruel lottery. Innocent or guilty, those subjected to the ordeal faced agony and a judgment no one could fully control. The ordeal of red-hot iron is a stark example of how justice, when divorced from reason and humanity, becomes a mechanism of suffering. It reveals the desperation of societies struggling to impose order in chaotic times, willing to sacrifice truth and compassion to the flames of superstition and fear. It forces us to reflect on the price paid by those caught in the merciless gears of history, a price measured in burning flesh, broken lives, and the haunting question of who truly deserved to live or die. Trial by water meant you'd drown either way. In the dark chapters of medieval justice, fear and superstition ruled far more than reason. When a person was accused of witchcraft, heresy, or treason, the law often failed them in terrifying ways. One of the most infamous, cruel, and deadly ordeals was the trial by water, sometimes called the swimming test, a grim ritual where the accused was bound and thrown into a body of water to prove their innocence or guilt. But in truth, this trial was a no-win sentence. To float was to be branded a witch, condemned by the very water that should have cleared them. To sink was to be judged innocent, but often it meant drowning before rescue could come. This was justice by death, a grim paradox of medieval law. The origins of trial by water trace back centuries, mingling pagan customs with Christian rites. Water, a symbol of purification and rebirth, was twisted into a weapon of judgment. The belief was simple yet horrifying. The pure, innocent soul would be embraced by the water and sink, while the guilty, marked by evil, would be rejected and float to the surface. This inversion of natural laws was accepted by courts and communities alike, a cruel twist that punished the accused no matter the outcome. On the day of trial, the accused, usually women, but sometimes men, were tightly bound. Their hands and feet were often tied to prevent them from swimming or struggling, effectively sealing their fate. They were then cast into a pond, river, or well. The witnesses gathered, their breaths held as they awaited the verdict of the water. If the body sank beneath the surface, it was a sign of innocence, a test passed by death. Often, those sinking were pulled out just in time, but many were not so fortunate. The cold embrace of the water claimed countless lives before rescue could intervene. If the accused floated, the judgment was immediate and fatal. A witch, evil incarnate, marked by God's own hand. They were dragged from the water, trembling, gasping, and then handed over to the secular authorities for execution, usually by burning at the stake, hanging, or other torturous means. Floating was a curse, a scarlet letter branded on the soul, sealing a horrific fate. Historical accounts revealed that trial by water was not simply a local superstition, but an accepted legal practice in many parts of Europe and colonial America well into the 17th century. In England, during the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, the swimming test was a standard ordeal, endorsed by courts desperate to root out supposed sorcery. Colonial America's infamous Salem witch trials featured similar methods, reflecting a terrifying belief in the water's power to judge the soul. But the test was deeply flawed, not just morally, but physically. The buoyancy of the human body depends on many factors: lung capacity, body fat, clothing, even the water's temperature and salinity. Bound limbs and heavy garments could drag the accused under, while some would float due to panic, trapped air, or physical constitution, sealing their doom by mere chance. The water was impartial only in its cruelty. Behind the ritual lay a deeper social and psychological terror. Accusations of witchcraft often stemmed from fear, envy, and scapegoating, neighbors turning against neighbors, families shattered by suspicion. Trial by water was as much a spectacle for the community as it was a legal proceeding. It served to reinforce social order by terrifying anyone who might stray from accepted norms, particularly women who were outspoken, widowed, or otherwise vulnerable. The ordeal was a public humiliation as well. The accused was paraded to the water's edge, stripped to some degree, mocked and jeered. Their suffering was entertainment for some, a lesson for others. The community watched as life and death hung on the water's whim. This ritual turned justice into theater, where the accused were actors in a tragic play scripted by fear and ignorance. Not all resisted, for resistance was futile. Those thrown into the water often entered the ordeal resigned, knowing that survival was uncertain. Some were forced into the test despite pleas and prayers. Others were dragged screaming, helpless and betrayed. For families, it was a horror beyond words, watching loved ones either drown or be condemned by a cruel twist of fate. Over time, as rational thought and science began to challenge superstition, trial by water fell out of favor. Legal reforms and Enlightenment thinking gradually dismantled these brutal tests. Yet the legacy remains a dark stain on human history, a chilling reminder of how justice can be perverted by fear, how superstition can overshadow mercy, and how countless innocent lives were lost to a ritual designed to condemn them, no matter the outcome. Today, the trial by water stands as a haunting symbol of medieval cruelty and the perils of blind faith in ritual over reason. It reminds us of the urgent need to separate fear from justice and to ensure that law protects, rather than destroys, those who stand accused. The cold waters of history run deep with stories of suffering, but from them, we learn the value of compassion and the dangers of judgment without evidence. Trial by water meant you'd drown either way. In the dark chapters of medieval justice, fear and superstition ruled far more than reason. When a person was accused of witchcraft, heresy, or treason, the law often failed them in terrifying ways. One of the most infamous, cruel, and deadly ordeals was the trial by water, sometimes called the swimming test, a grim ritual where the accused was bound and thrown into a body of water to prove their innocence or guilt. But in truth, this trial was a no-win sentence. To float was to be branded a witch, condemned by the very water that should have cleared them. To sink was to be judged innocent, but often it meant drowning before rescue could come. This was justice by death, a grim paradox of medieval law. The origins of trial by water trace back centuries, mingling pagan customs with Christian rites. Water, a symbol of purification and rebirth, was twisted into a weapon of judgment. The belief was simple yet horrifying. The pure, innocent soul would be embraced by the water and sink, while the guilty, marked by evil, would be rejected and float to the surface. This inversion of natural laws was accepted by courts and communities alike, a cruel twist that punished the accused no matter the outcome. On the day of trial, the accused, usually women, but sometimes men, were tightly bound. Their hands and feet were often tied to prevent them from swimming or struggling, effectively sealing their fate. They were then cast into a pond, river, or well. The witnesses gathered, their breaths held as they awaited the verdict of the water. If the body sank beneath the surface, it was a sign of innocence, a test passed by death. Often, those sinking were pulled out just in time, but many were not so fortunate. The cold embrace of the water claimed countless lives before rescue could intervene. If the accused floated, the judgment was immediate and fatal. A witch, evil incarnate, marked by God's own hand. They were dragged from the water, trembling, gasping, and then handed over to the secular authorities for execution, usually by burning at the stake, hanging, or other torturous means. Floating was a curse, a scarlet letter branded on the soul, sealing a horrific fate. Historical accounts revealed that trial by water was not simply a local superstition, but an accepted legal practice in many parts of Europe and colonial America well into the 17th century. In England, during the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, the swimming test was a standard ordeal, endorsed by courts desperate to root out supposed sorcery. Colonial America's infamous Salem witch trials featured similar methods, reflecting a terrifying belief in the water's power to judge the soul. But the test was deeply flawed, not just morally, but physically. The buoyancy of the human body depends on many factors: lung capacity, body fat, clothing, even the water's temperature and salinity. One historical account from the 16th century witch trials in Bamberg, Germany, describes a victim so thoroughly broken by torture that he confessed to utterly absurd crimes, admitting to conjuring storms and poisoning wells simply to halt the relentless suffering. Similarly, during England's religious upheavals, Protestant martyr Anne Askew was tortured on the rack until her limbs were so shattered she could no longer stand. Still, she refused to name fellow believers, an extraordinary act of courage, but her strength was rare. Most victims, innocent or not, simply could not endure. Medieval torture left behind not just physical scars, but deep psychological wounds. The trauma lasted long after confessions were extracted, lingering as terror in the minds of survivors, families, and entire communities. The very existence of these methods acted as a deterrent. People lived in fear, knowing innocence was never enough protection. The threat alone shaped society, silencing dissent, crushing rebellion, and reinforcing authority through sheer brutality. Ironically, even medieval jurists acknowledged that confessions extracted under torture were unreliable. Many legal texts cautioned judges about the danger of false admissions, yet torture persisted because fear was a more useful political tool than truth. It secured convictions, maintained social order, and reinforced the absolute power of church and state. Authorities understood well. A population living in constant dread of the rack and thumbscrews was easier to control, to manipulate, and to govern. Ultimately, the dark era of medieval torture underscores a chilling reality: that human dignity, truth, and innocence can be easily shattered when the pursuit of justice becomes a justification for cruelty. The echoes of screams from those hidden chambers still resonate through history, reminding us that when fear rules over reason, justice itself becomes a tormentor. Today, the rack, thumbscrews, and strappado are symbols of a terrifying age, but they also serve as warnings. They remind us that torture's power is not in uncovering truth, but in destroying humanity itself. The innocent and guilty alike succumbed under torture's relentless grip, forced to speak words that were never theirs, confessing crimes they never committed. In every confession extracted under agony, there lies the haunting truth about human vulnerability, the chilling knowledge that pain, carefully wielded, can corrupt even the purest soul. And as we remember this dark history, we must also remember that justice built upon brutality is no justice at all, only cruelty masked as righteousness. Juries were made of your enemies. In the dimly lit halls of medieval justice, where the scales were supposed to balance truth and fairness, another force quietly held sway, one far more powerful and far more dangerous. This was a world where the jury was not a neutral body of impartial observers, but a gathering of neighbors, rivals, and enemies, each carrying grudges older than the crimes on trial. In small towns and villages, justice was not blind. It was fiercely partisan, a battlefield where personal vendettas disguised themselves as law, and the fate of the accused often depended less on facts than on who held the most bitterness. The idea of a jury, ordinary people sworn to decide the truth, originated in medieval England as a way to involve the community in legal decisions. But this noble ideal collided headlong with the reality of medieval society, where social ties were tight and feuds ran deep. In a world where everyone knew everyone else's secrets, debts, and insults, selecting a jury was never about fairness. It was about power. The local lords, sheriffs, and officials who controlled the process often handpicked jurors, not for their honesty, but for their loyalty and willingness to serve the interests of the powerful or to settle old scores. Unlike today's concept of a jury drawn at random from a wide, anonymous pool, medieval juries were small, close-knit, and deeply enmeshed in the social fabric of the community. They were neighbors who might have suffered losses in land disputes, been insulted at the market, or carried wounds from decades-old grudges. Their verdicts were shaped by these relationships, sometimes consciously, often unconsciously, but always with an undercurrent of personal interest. Justice was less about law and more about who held the upper hand in local politics. This system created a breeding ground for corruption and cruelty. Innocent men and women could be condemned because they had fallen out of favor, owed money, or simply angered the wrong person. Conversely, the guilty might walk free if their allies dominated the jury or if bribes flowed into the pockets of the right men. Trials often resembled public spectacles more than sober inquiries, with crowds cheering or jeering, and jurors swayed by pressure, threats, or promises. Fear and loyalty tangled together, making true justice almost impossible. Moreover, the accusations themselves were often entangled in local conflicts. Charges of theft, heresy, or witchcraft might be weaponized to remove a rival or seize property. In rural villages, where the lines between family, neighbor, and enemy blurred, a trial could become the latest chapter in a long-running feud, with the jury acting as judge, jury, and executioner in one. The legal process, meant to protect the innocent, became another tool of oppression, wielded by the strong against the weak. The influence of powerful local figures exacerbated this problem. Lords and sheriffs often held sway over juries, intimidating or bribing them to deliver the verdicts they desired. A jury was less a group of peers and more an extension of the ruling elite's will. In some cases, juries were packed with men who had no qualms about twisting the truth to secure political or economic advantage. The accused, stripped of impartial judgment, faced a system rigged against them from the start. The consequences were devastating. Families were torn apart, reputations ruined, and lives lost on the whims of vengeance rather than evidence. The public's faith in the justice system eroded, replaced by fear and cynicism. To be accused was to face a trial not just of law, but of survival, where your fate rested in the hands of those who wished you harm. In many ways, medieval juries reflected the society they served: fractured, violent, and unforgiving. Yet this flawed system persisted for centuries because it served those in power and fit the social order of the time. The concept of fairness, impartiality, and universal rights was a luxury few could afford or even imagine. The medieval jury was a mirror to a world where personal allegiance and enmity defined every aspect of life, including the pursuit of justice. It wasn't until later legal reforms that the jury system began to shed these old entanglements. The rise of professional judges, the development of more standardized laws, and the expansion of the jury pool beyond local villages slowly pushed fairness closer to reality. But the echoes of those early days remain, a reminder that justice is fragile and that even the best systems can be corrupted by human nature. So when you think of the medieval court, do not picture blindfolded scales or serene judges. Instead, imagine a room charged with whispered grudges, hidden rivalries, and silent threats. A place where the jury might be your enemy, and the verdict was never certain, because justice was a prize fought over with venom, not truth. This was the harsh reality for those who faced trial in medieval England, where the law was only as fair as the hearts of those who wielded it. The story of medieval juries is a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing justice with personal vengeance, and a powerful reminder that the protection of the innocent requires more than laws on parchment. It demands vigilance, integrity, and the courage to rise above old grudges. In those days, to stand before the jury was not just to defend your actions, but to confront the very human forces that could twist justice into an instrument of cruelty. You could be tried without ever hearing the charges. Imagine being wrenched from your home in the dead of night, your hands bound, eyes blindfolded, and dragged through cold stone corridors to a place you have never seen before, a courtroom unlike any you might expect. You do not know what crime you are accused of. You are given no chance to prepare a defense, to call witnesses, or even to hear the charges against you. Before you can speak, the verdict has already been whispered behind closed doors, decided by unseen hands. This was not a nightmare from a dystopian fiction. This was reality for many in medieval and early modern Europe, where justice was a weapon wielded by the powerful to crush dissent, control subjects, and maintain fragile orders. The idea of a fair trial as we understand it today, where defendants are informed of accusations, can contest evidence, and are judged impartially, was a luxury almost unheard of in many historical contexts. Courts were often theaters of power, designed to reinforce hierarchy rather than uncover truth. The accused were spectators in a performance scripted by rulers, judges, or inquisitors whose aim was control, not fairness. In England during the Middle Ages, for example, the use of star chamber courts became infamous. These secret tribunals operated without juries, without public hearings, and most critically, without informing defendants in advance of the accusations. It was common for a person to be summoned to the Star Chamber and confronted with charges they had no prior knowledge of. The court's role was less to find justice and more to deliver predetermined outcomes. The accused had to respond on the spot, often under intense pressure, intimidation, or threats. Any defense was swiftly dismissed, and punishments ranged from hefty fines and property confiscation to imprisonment or even execution. This lack of procedural transparency was not limited to England. Across Europe, especially during the turbulent years of religious wars and political upheaval, secretive courts thrived. The infamous Roman Inquisition, established in the 16th century, often subjected accused heretics to trials where they were denied access to the specific accusations or evidence against them. The accused would endure interrogations, sometimes under torture, with the aim of extracting confessions regardless of actual guilt. The process was designed to silence, intimidate, and break spirits. Defendants did not stand equal before the law. Rather, they were pawns in a grim game where verdicts were often preordained. Even outside religious contexts, monarchs and nobles maintained courts where the accused could find themselves trapped in an opaque judicial system. In France, the Parlement of Paris held enormous power, but the accused might be brought to trial without clear charges, especially if the case involved political intrigue or noble disputes. Justice became a tool for settling scores rather than delivering fairness. Nobles and officials often exploited these practices, using secret accusations as weapons to eliminate rivals or consolidate power. The psychological toll on defendants was immense. Imagine the confusion, fear, and helplessness of being accused in a place where your voice could barely be heard, your innocence presumed less important than the maintenance of order. Families of the accused were often left in the dark, unable to intervene or prepare any defense. Trials proceeded at the whim of judges or rulers, and punishments were swift and brutal. Execution, exile, imprisonment in dungeons, these were common fates. Appeals were rare or impossible, as courts rarely published their procedures or records. The secrecy around charges also served to instill terror in the broader population. When people knew that accusations could be hidden, that arrests might come without warning or explanation, it bred a climate of fear and obedience. Ordinary citizens learned to avoid confrontation with authorities, and even nobles tread carefully, wary of becoming victims of secret trials. This climate helped rulers keep control over fractious territories and volatile populations, but at a terrible cost to justice and human dignity. Historical records reveal countless stories of individuals caught in these systems. Some were political dissidents, speaking out against tyrannical rulers. Others were accused of witchcraft, heresy, or treason based on hearsay or false testimony. Many suffered long imprisonments without trial, only to be tried in absentia or sentenced in courtrooms where the outcome was already sealed. Their voices were lost to history, but their suffering echoes through time as stark reminders of what justice without transparency becomes. Even legal thinkers and reformers recognized the dangers. The Magna Carta of 1215, for example, asserted the right to a fair trial and protection from arbitrary imprisonment, but it took centuries of struggle before such rights were more widely respected. Enlightenment thinkers fiercely condemned secret accusations and unfair trials, influencing the development of modern legal systems that emphasize openness, the right to defense, and the presumption of innocence. Yet, the legacy of these secret trials remains a warning. When courts operate without transparency, when accusations are hidden, and verdicts are decided before defense, justice is no longer justice. It becomes a weapon, a tool for oppression and fear. The medieval and early modern courts where you could be tried without hearing the charges remind us of the fragility of legal protections and the vital importance of openness and fairness in any system claiming to deliver justice. So next time you imagine justice as blind and impartial, remember those shadowed courts where darkness concealed accusations and verdicts were whispers behind closed doors. Remember the countless souls who faced judgment not with dignity, but with dread and silence. Their stories teach us that true justice demands light, the light of transparency, voice, and fairness. Without it, courts are no more than instruments of power, and innocence becomes a forgotten casualty in the pursuit of control. False witnesses were rarely punished. In medieval courts, truth was a fragile and often elusive prize, slipping through the fingers of justice like smoke. Accusations could be made by anyone, neighbors, rivals, even strangers, without proof or motive. The law might promise fairness, but in practice, it rewarded volume over veracity, and the loudest voices drowned out the silent truths. False witnesses thrived in this world, rarely punished, their lies wielded like weapons that could ruin lives with a single word. Imagine standing in a cold, stone hall, the murmur of a crowd hanging heavy in the air. A neighbor steps forward, eyes gleaming with spite or desperation, and accuses you of theft, adultery, or treason. No evidence is required, only the force of their claim. The judges, themselves often nobles or men with their own agendas, listen not for truth, but for drama. The louder and more confident the accusation, the more weight it carries. The accused, meanwhile, faces a labyrinth of legal hurdles, with few resources to defend themselves. Punishments for false testimony were theoretically severe. Perjury was a crime that could bring fines, imprisonment, or worse. But in reality, these punishments were seldom enforced. The courts depended on witnesses to fill the gaps where evidence was lacking, and a refusal to believe claims often meant denying justice altogether. To challenge a false witness was to challenge the authority of the court, to risk alienation and retaliation. Fear kept many silent, and lies unchecked. The consequences were devastating. Entire families could be shattered by a single false accusation. Lands lost, reputations destroyed, lives ruined, all on the basis of words whispered or shouted in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some used false testimony as a weapon of revenge, to settle old scores or to seize property. Others wielded it as a tool of power, knowing that courts would bend to the will of those who spoke loudest or held influence. This system bred paranoia and mistrust. People guarded their words carefully, wary of who might be listening, and ready to turn friend into foe with a careless phrase. Justice became a performance where the strength of one's voice and the sway of one's alliances mattered more than truth. The ideal of fairness was lost in a cacophony of claims, counterclaims, and silences. Despite the injustice, the courts rarely reformed this flaw. It was part of the larger medieval reality where law was inseparable from power and where truth was often secondary to social and political forces. It would take centuries and the rise of more modern legal principles before the idea of impartial evidence and protection against false accusations gained ground. The legacy of false witnesses in medieval justice is a stark warning. It reminds us how fragile truth can be when overshadowed by noise, how easily power corrupts justice, and how vital it is to protect the innocent not just in law, but in the very way we listen. In those stone halls, where echoes of accusation rang louder than cries of defense, many learned that speaking loudest was often the deadliest weapon of all. Witch trials used spectral evidence. You couldn't disprove. In the darkest chapters of human history, fear can twist truth into a weapon. Among the many horrors of the witch trials, one stands out for its chilling injustice: the use of spectral evidence. This was a form of proof that defied logic, reason, and any possibility of defense, a testimony that someone's spirit or apparition had appeared in a dream or vision to torment the accuser. Such evidence was invisible, intangible, and utterly impossible to disprove, yet it was enough to condemn countless innocent people to death. Imagine being accused not because you were caught in a crime, but because someone claimed your spirit haunted them while you slept miles away. The courts accepted these claims as truth, placing weight on visions and dreams as if they were physical evidence. The logic was twisted but simple. Only a witch could send her spirit forth to do harm, so if a victim saw an apparition, that was proof enough. No need for witnesses, no need for tangible proof, just fear, suspicion, and the weight of belief. Spectral evidence was most notoriously used during the Salem witch trials of 1692, when the people of a small colonial town were gripped by paranoia and hysteria. The so-called afflicted would describe visions of their tormentors' ghosts, shapes that pinched, choked, or attacked them in spectral form. These ghostly encounters were vivid, terrifying, and deeply convincing to those who experienced them. Judges accepted these testimonies at face value, and the accused found themselves powerless to argue against a force no one else could see. This type of evidence created a nightmare of legal injustice. How do you prove you did not send your spirit to harm someone? How do you defend yourself against a ghost that exists only in another's mind? The accused were trapped by an invisible noose, condemned by something that could neither be confirmed nor denied. The law became a farce, justice replaced by fear and superstition. The use of spectral evidence was rooted in a worldview dominated by religious and cultural beliefs that accepted the real and the supernatural as intertwined. In Puritan New England and many parts of Europe, the spirit world was close and active. Demons, witches, and evil spirits were thought to walk among the living, invisible, but deadly. Courts, clergy, and communities genuinely believed in the power of spectral attacks and saw their acceptance of such evidence as a sacred duty to root out evil. But this belief came at an enormous cost. Spectral evidence turned neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend, tearing communities apart. Families were destroyed as accusations spiraled beyond control. Innocent people were sentenced to hang based on dreams and visions that could be conjured by fear, jealousy, or malice. The very foundations of justice crumbled under the weight of invisible accusations. Some voices spoke against spectral evidence, warning of its dangers. Critics argued that accepting dreams as proof violated the principles of fairness and reason. They cautioned that such evidence was easily fabricated, manipulated, or mistaken. Yet, in the frenzy of witch hunts, these warnings were often drowned out by hysteria. The turning point came when courts began to question the reliability of spectral evidence. Judges in Massachusetts and elsewhere slowly recognized that the ghostly accusations could not serve as a foundation for justice. The infamous 1693 reversal of many Salem convictions hinged largely on the rejection of spectral testimony. This marked a critical step toward more rational legal standards. Still, the legacy of spectral evidence remains a stark warning. It shows how fear can warp systems meant to protect, how belief in the unseen can destroy lives, and how justice can be perverted when invisible accusations are accepted as truth. The witch trials stand as a dark mirror reflecting the dangers of abandoning evidence and reason. Today, spectral evidence serves as a powerful lesson. It reminds us that courts must rely on facts, that accusations require proof, and that justice must be grounded in reality, not fear. The ghosts of those wrongfully condemned continue to haunt history, urging us never to forget the price of blind belief. The Church could put you on trial for thought crimes. In the shadowy corridors of medieval Europe, no threat loomed larger than the accusation of heresy. The Church, mighty and omnipresent, held sway not just over public life, but over private thoughts, hidden doubts, and whispered questions. To the medieval mind, faith was not simply belief, it was loyalty, obedience, and conformity. Even a single careless remark, perhaps overheard in a crowded tavern or murmured in a moment of despair, could plunge an ordinary person into a terrifying spiral of suspicion, interrogation, and ultimately, death. Heresy, defined simply, was any idea or belief that deviated from the official teachings of the Church. But in reality, the crime was far more insidious. The medieval Church claimed authority not just over actions, but over souls themselves. To doubt, to question, to even quietly wonder about church doctrine was to risk everything. The Church saw itself as the guardian of spiritual purity, and heresy as a deadly contagion. Its response was brutal, swift, and merciless, intended as a warning to anyone who dared to think freely. The accusation could come from anywhere: a jealous neighbor, a disgruntled servant, even family members seeking revenge. Often the accused never knew their crime until they were dragged before the authorities. Once suspicion took root, it spread quickly, like wildfire. Friends and family, terrified of being implicated themselves, quickly abandoned the accused. Isolation deepened, trust evaporated, and soon the accused found themselves utterly alone, facing the might of the Church's inquisitorial machinery. Trials for heresy were unlike any modern court proceedings. Secretive, intimidating, and utterly ruthless, they were designed not to uncover truth, but to extract confessions. The Inquisition, the Church's notorious judicial arm, was relentless. Their tools were fear, psychological manipulation, and physical torture. Victims endured interrogation after interrogation, each more intense than the last. In the cold darkness of a dungeon, even the strongest minds crumbled under the crushing weight of relentless questioning and endless accusations. Torture was not just permitted, it was routine. Instruments like the rack, thumbscrews, the strappado, and water torture were used with chilling regularity. Victims screamed out confessions to end the agony, admitting to thoughts they'd never truly held, beliefs they'd never actually considered. Innocence meant nothing. The accused learned quickly that the Church was not interested in truth. It sought only submission. And submission, tragically, was always found, no matter the cost to human dignity. In 1324, in Kilkenny, Ireland, Dame Alice Keitler became one of the earliest victims of a heresy trial. Her crime? Whispered rumors of witchcraft and private skepticism about church rituals. She barely escaped with her life, but her servant Petronilla was not so fortunate, tortured and burned at the stake, accused merely of associating with her employer's supposed doubts. Similarly, in the 15th century, Jan Hus, a Czech priest and reformer, questioned the Church's authority over spiritual truth. His private doubts soon became public accusations. Despite assurances of safe passage, Hus was arrested, condemned as a heretic, and burned alive. His story illustrates how dangerous even private convictions could become once discovered. Yet perhaps most infamous was the Spanish Inquisition. Under the direction of Torquemada in the late 15th century, tens of thousands were accused, tortured, and executed for thought crimes, secret Judaism, hidden skepticism, or private disagreement with Catholic dogma. Even a hesitation during prayer or an overheard remark could spark suspicion. The result was a society paralyzed by fear, where trust vanished and silence became survival. Medieval Europe lived under the shadow of these horrors for centuries. Churches and cathedrals became places not of refuge, but of constant dread. The priest's gaze was feared as much as the executioner's blade. To question was heresy. To doubt was death. And thus, society itself became captive, not just in body, but in mind and soul. Thought itself became a dangerous act. But why did the Church go to such extremes? At its core, the relentless pursuit of heresy was about control. By policing belief, the Church could preserve power, crush dissent, and silence reformers before their ideas took root. It was a cruel, effective strategy. People were forced to censor their thoughts, guard their words, and suppress their curiosity. Innovation and intellectual freedom withered under the constant threat of persecution. Yet, paradoxically, the severity of the Church's persecution only fueled the desire for change. Secret societies, underground reformers, and private circles of intellectual rebels formed, defying oppression in whispers and secret meetings. The very brutality meant to crush dissent ultimately sparked the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, centuries later, stood upon the ruins of medieval fear, openly challenging the Church's tyranny of thought. In hindsight, the terror of medieval heresy trials reveals a chilling lesson. When power attempts to control thought, humanity suffers deeply. Yet it also shows something profoundly hopeful. Ideas cannot truly be imprisoned. Even under threat of torture and death, the human spirit seeks truth, questions authority, and longs for freedom. And though the Inquisition's fires burned thousands, the ideas it tried to destroy ultimately reshaped the world. Today, the medieval legacy serves as a stark reminder. True justice demands freedom of thought, and genuine faith is not forged in fear, but chosen freely. History warns us that when beliefs become crimes, society itself becomes a prison, and the human spirit, no matter how oppressed, always finds a way to break free. Animals were put on trial and executed. Imagine a medieval village square, crowded with townsfolk gathered not for a festival or market day, but for a spectacle so strange and unsettling that it blurs the line between justice and superstition. Here, in front of a stern judge and a murmuring crowd, a pig stands accused of murder. Nearby, a cow awaits its fate for trampling a child. These were not scenes from a nightmare, but real events. Animal trials that unfolded across medieval Europe with solemnity and legal procedure, revealing a world where the boundaries between human and beast, law and belief, justice and fear, were astonishingly fluid. The idea of putting animals on trial may seem bizarre to us now, but in the Middle Ages, it was rooted in a worldview where animals were seen as moral agents capable of sin, guilt, and even malicious intent. The church and legal authorities believed that creatures could be held responsible for their actions, especially when those actions harmed humans. Animals, like people, could be summoned, tried, and punished for offenses ranging from destruction of property to homicide. Courtrooms were real theaters of justice, complete with summons issued to the animals' owners, legal counsel appointed in some cases, and detailed proceedings. Pigs, cows, horses, dogs, even insects were defendants in trials that mimicked human legal practices. These trials were taken seriously, reflecting the medieval obsession with order and divine justice. The law sought to maintain social and cosmic balance, and when an animal caused harm, it was seen as a disruption that demanded rectification. The punishments meted out were as severe as those given to human criminals. Animals found guilty were executed, hanged, burned, or mutilated, often in public ceremonies that reinforced the authority of the law and the moral order. These executions were meant to serve as warnings, deterring not only animals but humans from transgressions. The spectacle affirmed the community's control over nature and the limits of chaos, but these trials also exposed the precariousness of human life in the medieval world. If animals, considered lesser beings, could be held accountable and punished, what hope was there for humans caught in a justice system rife with bias, superstition, and power struggles? The legal machinery that tried a pig for murder was the same that condemned peasants for minor offenses or heresy, often without fair trial or mercy. It revealed a society struggling to impose order amid uncertainty and fear, where justice was as much about ritual and symbolism as about truth. Moreover, the trials reflected deep anxieties about the natural world and humanity's place within it. Harmful animals were seen as agents of divine punishment or manifestations of evil, blurring the lines between physical danger and spiritual threat. By putting animals on trial, communities attempted to assert control over forces that seemed wild, unpredictable, and hostile. These trials have left behind curious records, court transcripts, church decrees, and folk tales that challenge our modern understanding of justice and humanity. They remind us that law is not fixed but shaped by culture, belief, and the needs of the time. They reveal a world where even the most bizarre practices served a purpose: to create meaning, enforce order, and confront the terrifying uncertainties of life. So, next time you think about justice, remember the medieval animal trials, a time when the line between man and beast was drawn in the courtroom, and where the execution of a pig was as significant as the fate of a human soul. It was a world where survival was never guaranteed, and where law, fear, and belief intertwined in the most unexpected ways. Wealth determined your fate from the start. In the harsh realities of medieval and early modern society, wealth was not just a matter of comfort or status. It was the very determinant of your fate. From the moment of birth, the invisible line dividing the poor from the wealthy set the course for life and death, justice and impunity. Imagine a world where stealing a loaf of bread to feed your starving family could send you to the gallows, while a noble who took a life with cold intent could escape punishment by paying a sum of money or claiming divine sanction. This was not an aberration or exception, but the brutal norm. The legal systems of the time were deeply skewed in favor of the wealthy elite. Laws existed on paper to maintain order, but their application was profoundly unequal. For the poor, every misstep was a potential death sentence. Theft, even petty theft born of hunger, was punished severely. Hanging was a common penalty, public and humiliating, designed not only to punish the accused, but to send a stark warning to the masses. Courts often showed little mercy, as poverty was viewed not as misfortune, but as moral failing or threat to social order. Contrast this with the privileges enjoyed by nobles and landowners. The wealthy had access to legal protections unavailable to the poor. They could invoke the doctrine of divine right, a belief that kings and nobles were chosen by God, placing them above ordinary laws. This sanctity often extended to their actions, shielding them from prosecution even in cases of murder. If a noble killed a commoner, or even a rival, the courts might turn a blind eye or allow them to negotiate a blood money settlement, essentially buying their freedom with gold. This system created a grotesque hierarchy of justice. One well-documented example is from 14th century England, where the aristocracy enjoyed benefit of clergy, a legal privilege that let them avoid harsh secular punishments by claiming clerical status, even if they were lay nobles. This loophole allowed them to escape execution or brutal penalties that a poor thief would face without question. The disparity extended beyond the courts. Wealthy individuals hired skilled lawyers, bribed officials, or leveraged influence to manipulate outcomes. The poor, trapped in ignorance and desperation, had no such recourse. They were often forced to confess under torture or coerced into guilty pleas simply to avoid the worst. Justice was transactional, and money was the currency that bought leniency. The concept of blood money itself, compensation paid by a murderer or offender to the victim's family, reflected a system where human life had a price tag, one that varied dramatically by social status. While a noble's payment might be a heavy fine but acceptable, a poor person's life was considered almost worthless. The very laws that claimed to protect life instead codified inequality, perpetuating cycles of poverty and violence. Such realities bred resentment and fear. The lower classes lived under constant threat, knowing that their survival depended not only on their actions, but on a system rigged against them. Peasants and urban poor alike faced brutal punishments for minor offenses, while the wealthy flaunted their privileges with impunity. Rebellions and unrest often sparked from these injustices, as those denied justice sought to challenge the entrenched order. Yet, some voices protested. Reformers and philosophers over centuries decried the stark inequalities of medieval justice. They argued for fairness, equality before the law, and the idea that punishment should fit the crime, not the criminal's purse. These ideals slowly seeded the foundations of modern legal systems, though the shadow of economic bias in justice still lingers today. Looking back, the stark truth remains. In a world governed by wealth and power, your fate was often decided before the trial began. The hungry man who stole bread to survive faced the noose, while the noble who shed blood could walk free, his sins paid in gold or sanctified by birthright. It was a society where justice was a privilege, not a right, and where money could buy freedom while poverty meant death. This grim reality shaped centuries of human history and left a legacy that challenges us to reflect on the meaning of true justice and equality. Speaking the truth against nobility was treason. Speaking the truth against nobility in medieval times was not an act of courage or justice. It was an act of rebellion, an assault on the very foundations of society, punishable by death. To accuse a powerful lord or lady, even when guilt was certain, was to challenge the divine order, to threaten the hierarchy that kept kingdoms in fragile balance. The penalty was swift and brutal: charges of treason, public disgrace, and execution. Truth became not a path to justice, but a dangerous gamble with life itself. In the rigid social structure of the Middle Ages, power was concentrated in the hands of the few: the nobility, the clergy, the monarchs. Their authority was considered absolute, sanctioned not only by law, but by divine right. The idea that a commoner or even a lesser noble might openly accuse someone above them was unthinkable. The courts were instruments of the elite, designed to protect their interests and silence dissent. Laws against treason were broad and malleable, often weaponized to quash any challenge to the ruling class. When someone spoke out against a noble, whether exposing corruption, abuse, or crime, they risked being branded a traitor. The charge of treason was the ultimate weapon. Its definition stretched to encompass anything from rebellion to mere insult. The accused faced trials that were little more than formalities, with verdicts predetermined by the influence of the accused. Torture was common, confessions coerced, witnesses bought or intimidated. The accused's words, no matter how truthful, were twisted into evidence of their guilt. The consequences extended beyond the individual. Families could be stripped of lands and titles, entire communities punished for the actions of one outspoken member. Fear permeated society, silencing voices and fostering a culture of obedience and secrecy. Truth became dangerous, spoken only in whispers or in private prayers, lest the price be one's head on the chopping block. Yet, despite the risks, some dared to speak. Their stories, passed down in chronicles and legends, reveal the human cost of this brutal justice. They paid with imprisonment, exile, or death, martyrs for a truth the powerful refused to hear. Their courage was a seed for later ideas about justice, rights, and accountability, but in their own time, it was a rebellion crushed with steel and fire. This harsh reality shaped medieval life. It reinforced the distance between rulers and ruled, between those who wielded power and those who lived under it. It maintained a system where justice was a privilege, not a right, and where truth was often the loudest lie in the room. To challenge nobility was not merely dangerous, it was deadly. Reflecting on this history reminds us how fragile freedom of speech once was, how easily it was extinguished by fear and force. It shows us the courage of those who risked everything to speak out, and the brutal lengths those in power would go to protect their status. The legacy is a testament to the enduring struggle for truth and justice, a struggle that, even today, continues in many parts of the world. In the end, speaking the truth against nobility was not just treason. It was a challenge to the very idea of power, a challenge that many paid for with their lives, and a challenge that echoes through history as a warning and an inspiration. Trials could take place in secret. Trials conducted in secret have cast long shadows over history, a realm where justice was elusive and fear ruled supreme. Imagine a place not filled with the light of day or the noise of a public courtroom, but rather the cold silence of a dungeon or the forbidding stillness behind monastery doors. In these hidden chambers, justice did not come with fanfare or fairness. It arrived in whispers, with no audience, no advocate, and no record. Only judgment awaited those accused. Throughout medieval and early modern Europe, secret trials were tools wielded by monarchs, inquisitors, and local powers to silence dissent, punish enemies, and protect their own authority. Unlike the public courts where laws were spoken aloud and evidence presented openly, these clandestine proceedings were shrouded in mystery and designed to disempower. Accused persons, often unaware of their rights, found themselves plunged into darkness, both literal and figurative, where their fate was decided behind locked doors and unseen by the very society they lived in. One of the defining features of these secret trials was the absence of witnesses or legal representation. The accused stood alone, facing judges or inquisitors who held absolute power over their fate. There were no lawyers to argue for innocence, no juries to weigh evidence impartially. The voices of accusers could echo unchecked in the silent chambers, and the accused had no means to respond or defend themselves. This imbalance turned trials into acts of domination rather than pursuits of truth. Records of these trials, if kept at all, were often destroyed or hidden, leaving only faint traces in official documents or personal letters. This secrecy made it nearly impossible for families or communities to appeal decisions or demand fairness. Without transparency, miscarriages of justice thrived. Innocents were condemned, and political rivals eliminated under the guise of legal authority. Inquisition tribunals exemplify this dark practice. Religious courts, charged with rooting out heresy, frequently held secret hearings. Detainees were brought before masked inquisitors, interrogated in cells away from prying eyes. Torture was common, and confessions extracted under duress sealed their doom. The public knew little of these proceedings, but the fear they inspired spread far beyond the dungeon walls. Political prisoners, too, suffered under secret justice. Monarchs who felt threatened by nobles or clerics used covert trials to dispose of opponents without public scandal. Imprisoned in cold towers, these accused were tried in rooms where the only audience was the shadows on the stone walls. The verdict was swift, and punishment often brutal. These trials served not justice, but consolidation of power. The secrecy of these courts bred an atmosphere of paranoia and terror. People whispered of neighbors disappearing, of unseen judgments falling like a guillotine in the dark. The accused had little hope, for the law itself was a weapon wielded by the powerful. The lack of transparency ensured that fear maintained control, and the notion of a fair trial became a distant dream. Despite this, some voices within history challenged these practices. Philosophers and early legal reformers argued for openness, the right to defense, and public scrutiny as pillars of justice. Their calls laid groundwork for modern legal principles, emphasizing that justice must not only be done, but be seen to be done. Today, we look back at these secret trials with horror and disbelief. They remind us of the dangers when law is separated from fairness, when power is unchecked, and when fear eclipses truth. The silence behind dungeon doors speaks volumes about the fragility of justice and the importance of transparency. In remembering those who suffered in these hidden courts, we reaffirm a commitment to open, fair, and accountable legal systems. The shadows of secret trials warn us that justice denied to one is justice denied to all. The lessons of history compel us to ensure that every trial is conducted not in darkness, but in the clear light of fairness and truth. You could be executed for bad omens. In the heart of medieval Europe, beneath the shadow of towering castles and behind the comforting rituals of village life, a sinister fear lingered, a fear woven from whispers, superstitions, and dread of the unknown. Life was uncertain, governed by forces far beyond human control, and when misfortune struck, an illness, a crop failure, a sudden storm, eyes would turn suspiciously toward neighbors, searching desperately for someone to blame. In such a world, even the most trivial events, a black cat crossing your path, a sneeze at the wrong moment, or the rumble of unexpected thunder, could seal your fate, turning you from innocent villager into accused criminal. In medieval society, nature wasn't merely something observed, it was something feared, interpreted, and judged. Ordinary people saw signs and omens everywhere, woven into the fabric of their daily lives. The flight of a crow, a sudden storm cloud, even the timing of a cough or a sneeze, all became signals from a mysterious universe. These seemingly harmless occurrences carried immense symbolic power, interpreted as direct messages, either warnings or curses, from forces supernatural, divine, or demonic. But why was medieval society so fixated on these omens? At its core, it came down to uncertainty and powerlessness. Disease could ravage a community overnight. Famine could destroy generations in a single season. With no understanding of modern science, people turned desperately to superstition. Every misfortune demanded explanation, someone to blame. Thus, bad omens became evidence in courts, used against neighbors, rivals, or strangers who seemed suspicious. The line between superstition and law blurred dangerously, and innocent people often paid with their lives. In 15th century Germany, at the height of the witch hunts, court records document shocking trials where villagers were accused simply because something strange had occurred near their home. One woman was burned at the stake after her neighbor's cows suddenly sickened. Her crime? A black cat had repeatedly been spotted outside her door. Proof, said the judges, that she had cursed the livestock. Another man faced trial because lightning struck a tree near his farm. Villagers saw the thunderbolt as divine punishment, a sign that the farmer had angered the heavens. He died, executed for a crime of nature rather than one of his own making. In England, under King James I's paranoid reign, suspicion soared. In the infamous Pendle witch trials of 1612, mere accusations linked to trivial omens became evidence enough to convict. One elderly woman faced execution because a neighbor sneezed repeatedly after passing her house, a clear sign of witchcraft, argued the court. In another case, villagers accused a woman of conjuring storms after a sudden thunderclap frightened livestock near her cottage. Fear, ignorance, and superstition turned coincidence into crime, and innocent lives ended at the stake or gallows. But how did these absurd trials become accepted? Partly, it was the authority of the church and the courts. Both institutions sought order and control, using superstition to maintain their grip on fearful populations. Judges, priests, and inquisitors reinforced these beliefs, warning villagers to watch closely for unnatural events and signs of evil. The authorities argued that demons spoke through omens, black cats, sudden chills, thunderstorms, to reveal their servants, the witches hidden among ordinary folk. This paranoid culture made daily life terrifyingly uncertain. Ordinary activities, keeping pets, visiting neighbors, even sneezing, became dangerous. Villagers lived in constant anxiety, knowing that at any moment the natural world could turn against them, dragging them before the court to face death. Communities fragmented, trust evaporated, and the bonds that held society together weakened. People began accusing each other preemptively, desperate to prove their own innocence by shifting suspicion onto others. One tragic consequence of this obsession was that rationality and compassion disappeared. Trials rarely examined actual evidence or motive, relying instead on hysterical testimonies about unnatural signs. Judges seldom questioned accusations based on omens, believing fully in the supernatural interpretations. Entire families were destroyed, neighbors turned into bitter enemies, and generations scarred forever, all because of fear of natural phenomena they could neither control nor comprehend. The tide slowly turned only when Enlightenment ideas spread across Europe, bringing reason, scientific inquiry, and skepticism. Omens gradually lost their legal weight, courts demanded tangible evidence, and superstition faded into folklore rather than law. But by then, thousands had already perished, innocent victims whose only crime was proximity to nature's random whims. Today, this grim chapter of history serves as a powerful reminder of how quickly society can descend into fear, suspicion, and cruelty when faced with uncertainty. It warns us how fragile rationality can become when superstition and ignorance gain authority. Medieval Europe's trials based on bad omens, black cats, sneezes, thunderstorms, teach us a haunting truth, that when humanity surrenders reason, justice itself becomes a victim, and innocent lives are extinguished by fear disguised as faith. And so, centuries later, we look back upon those tragic victims, men and women whose lives ended simply because of coincidence or nature's unpredictability. Their stories linger, whispered through history as warnings. They remind us never to abandon reason, compassion, or justice, no matter how frightening or unpredictable our world might become. Torture was used just to prove you were truly sorry. In the shadowed courts of medieval justice, where laws were etched with cruelty and mercy was a rare stranger, torture was not merely a means of extracting confession. It was a ritual of purification, a brutal ceremony designed to prove the sincerity of repentance. Imagine a world where the innocence of a person meant little, where even a voluntary confession was not enough to spare one from agony, and where the courts demanded pain not just to punish, but to cleanse the soul before death. This was a world that twisted justice into a spectacle of suffering, where torture became a grotesque symbol of remorse and control. The medieval legal system was built on an unyielding belief in the power of confession. A confession was not just evidence, it was salvation, a ticket to mercy that only the guilty could earn by admitting their sins. Yet, paradoxically, the act of confessing was often not enough to satisfy the authorities. They demanded more, a proof that the accused was truly sorry, genuinely repentant, and worthy of the final grace. This proof came in the form of torture, a cruel ordeal that went beyond forcing the truth from lips. It sought to burn away the stain of sin with fire and steel. Even those who confessed freely, without the lash or the rack, were dragged into chambers of horror. Their bodies were stretched, burned, or crushed, as if agony itself could wash away guilt or make forgiveness tangible. The courts claimed this pain was a sacred rite, a spiritual cleansing that prepared the condemned for death and the afterlife. The tortured flesh was supposed to be a sacrificial offering, a physical testament to penitence. Yet in practice, it was a tool of terror and domination, wielded by judges and inquisitors who believed that only through pain could a soul be made pure. This ritual of torture was indifferent to innocence or guilt. Innocent men and women, caught in webs of accusation or political intrigue, suffered alongside the guilty. Their pleas of innocence were drowned beneath screams and the cold mechanics of devices designed to inflict maximum pain. The court cared not whether the confession was true, only that it be made under the shadow of suffering. The tortured body was the court's proof, the evidence that no soul could escape judgment unscathed. The instruments of this cleansing were horrifying in their variety and ingenuity. The rack stretched limbs until joints dislocated. Thumbscrews crushed fingers. The Iron Maiden enclosed victims in a cage of spikes. The Strapito hung prisoners by the wrists, wrenching their shoulders from sockets. These were not mere punishments, but carefully designed ceremonies of pain, public and private, meant to break not only bodies, but wills. Witnesses, often friends, family, or neighbors, were forced to watch, reinforcing the power of the law and the inevitability of punishment. What makes this system even more chilling is the psychological torment layered over the physical. The accused knew that confession might save their life, but only if followed by agony that proved their sincerity. Silence, denial, or even reluctant admission without pain was considered suspect, signs of a hardened heart or hidden guilt. The courts demanded a confession sealed with blood and tears, a performance of suffering that could be manipulated, coerced, or outright fabricated. Innocence was powerless against such machinery. This approach reflected the medieval understanding of justice and spirituality. Sin was seen not only as a legal offense, but as a wound on the soul. Torture was medicine, albeit a savage one, meant to heal spiritual disease through bodily affliction. It was an attempt to reconcile earthly punishment with divine mercy, to transform the condemned from sinner to penitent in the eyes of God and man, but in reality, It was a weapon of fear and control, a way to assert dominance over life and death. The consequences were devastating. Many died under torture before any sentence was passed. Others emerged broken, forced to confess crimes they did not commit simply to end their suffering. The innocent bled alongside the guilty, and the truth became a casualty in the theater of pain. Families were shattered, reputations destroyed, and communities terrified by the unpredictable reach of torture's shadow. Over time, voices rose against such cruelty. Philosophers, jurists, and eventually reformers began to question the morality and efficacy of torture, leading to gradual legal reforms. But for centuries, the belief that agony was the ultimate proof of remorse ruled unchecked, leaving behind a legacy of horror and injustice. Today, we look back on these practices with disbelief and revulsion, struggling to comprehend a system where mercy demanded torture and innocence was no shield from suffering. Yet understanding this dark chapter is crucial. It reminds us how easily justice can be perverted when power is unchecked, when fear replaces reason, and when the value of a human soul is measured by the depth of its pain. In the echoes of those cold stone courts, we hear the silent screams of countless victims, innocent and guilty alike, whose only crime was to be caught in a system that demanded suffering as proof of sorrow. Their stories warn us that true justice must be more than confession and pain. It must be rooted in fairness, compassion, and the unwavering respect for human dignity. The law changed, based on the day or ruler. In the medieval and early modern world, laws were far from the stable, predictable systems we expect today. Instead, they were fluid, ever-shifting codes shaped by whoever held power at the moment. Imagine waking up one morning in your village only to discover that the rules you lived by yesterday, what you said, what you owned, even how you worshipped, had been overturned overnight. What was acceptable behavior last week could suddenly be branded treason, heresy, or a capital crime, and you would remain oblivious until you stood accused before a court. This mercurial nature of law was not an anomaly, but a defining feature of governance in those turbulent times. The reason for this instability was simple. Authority was intensely personal and localized. Kings, lords, bishops, and abbots wielded immense power over their domains, often ruling with near absolute authority. There was no overarching, codified national legal system to provide consistency. Instead, the law was a reflection of the whims, politics, and ambitions of the current ruler. When a new lord or bishop took office, one of their first acts could be rewriting the laws that governed daily life, sometimes to assert their control, punish rivals, or shift the social order. Take, for instance, the English feudal system, where landowners exercised judicial rights over their tenants and serfs. A newly installed lord could impose harsher taxes, outlaw previously accepted trades, or criminalize speech against him, all by decree. Local customs, which had evolved over generations, could be swept aside, replaced by edicts that no one expected. Peasants who once freely gathered wood for fuel could suddenly be accused of theft. A merchant's contract valid last month might be voided, subjecting him to fines or imprisonment. Ecclesiastical authorities added another layer of complexity. Bishops and abbots held both spiritual and temporal power, often acting as judges in church courts. These courts had their own legal codes, which could be changed to suppress dissent, enforce religious conformity, or seize wealth. For example, a bishop might declare a particular practice heretical one day and punish anyone found engaging in it, even if that practice had been commonplace before. Lay people caught in these shifting jurisdictions had little chance to defend themselves, often unaware of the new laws until arrested. The volatility intensified during periods of political upheaval. Civil wars, dynastic struggles, or religious conflicts led to rapid changes in leadership. Each faction, upon gaining control, sought to legitimize its rule by rewriting laws to outlaw opponents and reward allies. In France, the wars of religion in the late 16th century saw Catholic and Protestant rulers alternately impose harsh laws that criminalized each other's beliefs, turning neighbors into enemies overnight. The populace lived in a constant state of uncertainty, never knowing which laws would apply until enforced by sword or decree. This fluidity extended to the concept of treason itself, a crime often defined by the ruler's perspective. What one lord considered a loyal act, another might brand as rebellion. A word spoken in defense of a fallen regime could be twisted into evidence of conspiracy. Since laws were personal and often unwritten, accusations of treason became powerful tools to eliminate political rivals or suppress dissent. Trials lacked transparency, and the accused were often denied knowledge of the charges until faced with judgment. For ordinary people, this instability bred fear and confusion. Contracts became unreliable, property rights shaky, and social norms unpredictable. Merchants hesitated to trade across regions, peasants feared unjust punishment, and communities fractured under the weight of shifting allegiances. Survival often depended on the ability to quickly adapt to new rules, seek favor with the ruling elite, or escape before a new decree turned one's life upside down. Historical records are full of stories where the law's sudden transformation caused ruin. In some cases, entire families were branded traitors when a new lord claimed their lands and outlawed their previous rights. In others, long-accepted religious practices became crimes overnight, leading to arrests and executions. Even nobles, accustomed to power, found themselves vulnerable if they failed to anticipate legal shifts or fell out of favor. The personal nature of law also meant that corruption thrived. Lords could sell legal favors, grant pardons for bribes, or manipulate laws to enrich themselves. Justice was not blind, but a reflection of power dynamics and personal relationships. The absence of codified uniform laws left room for arbitrary rule, where the line between justice and tyranny blurred. It was not until the gradual development of centralized states and codified legal systems, like England's common law or France's Napoleonic Code, that some stability emerged. These systems aimed to standardize laws, make them accessible, and protect individuals from the whims of rulers. Yet, even today, the legacy of law's fluid origins reminds us how deeply law depends on power structures and cultural contexts. In the medieval world, law was a living, shifting thing, an extension of the ruler's will rather than an impartial system. To live under such conditions was to walk a tightrope of uncertainty, where yesterday's law could become today's crime without warning. This reality shaped societies built on obedience, fear, and adaptation, underscoring that in history, justice was often less about fairness and more about survival under the ever-changing shadow of power. You could be tried for crimes committed by your family. In the shadowed courts of medieval justice, guilt was not always a personal burden. It could be a hereditary curse, passed down through blood and association. To live under a system where the sins of one man condemned entire families was to exist in a world where loyalty and lineage were chains as heavy as any prison. If your father or brother committed a crime, whether a theft, rebellion, or even an offense as grave as treason, you could be tried, punished, or even executed simply for being related. The law did not distinguish between the individual and the clan. Family ties were bonds of fate, binding innocent men, women, and children to crimes they never committed. This brutal concept was rooted in medieval notions of honor, loyalty, and collective responsibility. Society was organized around kinship and clan structures, where the actions of one member reflected on the entire family's honor and standing. Lords and kings relied on these ideas to maintain order and control. Punishing an entire family sent a message that crime was a stain that could not be contained. It corrupted all those connected by blood. It was a warning that justice was not just about right and wrong, but about power and deterrence. Legal systems codified this harsh reality. Laws held families accountable, enabling authorities to seize lands, titles, and wealth from entire houses for the misdeeds of one member. Sometimes, the punishment was collective execution. Men, women, even children dragged before the courts and condemned without regard to their own actions. History is scarred with tales of noble families wiped out for the treason of a single relative. Peasants whose households were shattered because one member broke a law, and communities living in constant fear that one misstep would doom them all. The consequences were devastating and far-reaching. Families fractured, trust eroded, and alliances shifted as people sought to distance themselves from those marked by crime. The guilty might hide among their kin, but the innocent could find no refuge. The children of traitors were stigmatized, denied inheritance, and cast into poverty or exile. Even the loyal suffered, caught in a web woven from the misdeeds of a relative. This system was often manipulated by those in power. Accusations could be made to eliminate rivals by targeting their families. Courts became theaters of political intrigue, where the collective guilt principle served as a tool to consolidate authority and crush dissent. The law's brutality extended beyond justice. It was an instrument of fear, designed to enforce obedience through the threat of annihilation. Yet, amid this darkness, stories of resistance and survival emerge. Families sought royal pardons, forged alliances, or fled into exile to escape collective punishment. Some chronicled their sufferings, pleading for mercy or justice in petitions that reveal the human cost behind the legal abstractions. Over time, ideas of individual responsibility began to challenge the notion of collective guilt, leading gradually to reforms and protections. But in medieval times, blood ties were often a sentence in themselves. Understanding this harsh reality offers a glimpse into the fragility of medieval life, where fate was intertwined with family and where justice could be blind to innocence. It forces us to confront the weight of inherited guilt and the price paid by those who bore no crime but the accident of birth. It is a story of power wielded mercilessly and a reminder of the long journey toward fairness and individual rights in law. In the end, being tried for crimes committed by your family was not just punishment, it was a social death sentence, a chilling testament to a world where blood bound not only kinship but also fate, where entire lineages could be erased by the sins of one, and where survival depended on the mercy of rulers as much as on one's own innocence.
Trial by combat rewarded the strong, not the just. Trial by combat was a brutal, unforgiving form of justice where might often trumped right. In medieval times, when disputes could not be settled by witnesses or documents, courts sometimes turned to the sword and shield to declare the winner. But this was not a battle for truth or fairness. It was a test of strength, skill, and sometimes sheer luck. Even if you were innocent, even if your cause was just, you face a terrifying reality. If your opponent was stronger, faster, or had hired a skilled champion to fight for them, you lost your case, and quite possibly, your life. The origins of trial by combat stretch back to ancient Germanic law and were later absorbed into medieval European legal systems, especially in England and France. It was seen as a divine judgment, a way to let God decide who was truthful by granting victory to the righteous. Yet, this divine intervention was often overshadowed by the brutal reality on the battlefield. The combat was a physical struggle, a fight to the death or until one party yielded. Justice was measured not by facts or fairness, but by endurance and martial prowess. The accused and the accuser, or their champions, would meet in an arena, sometimes before a crowd or court officials. The fight was regulated, with rules governing weapons and conduct, but it was no less savage. Knights clad in armor, wielding swords, maces, or axes, clashed in contests that could last minutes or hours. The outcome was unpredictable. A single blow could end the trial. A stumble, a broken weapon, or fatigue could tip the scales. For those without combat training, the prospect was terrifying. Even nobles, who were often skilled fighters, faced grave danger. Many sought to hire professional champions, mercenaries, or warriors who fought on their behalf. This introduced a disturbing inequality into the system. Wealthier parties could afford champions, turning trials into contests of resources rather than truth. The poor and untrained stood little chance against a hired sword. Historical records show that trial by combat could be used in cases ranging from accusations of theft and assault to disputes over land and honor. It was sometimes seen as a last resort when all other evidence had failed or when no witnesses were available. The spectacle of combat served both judicial and social functions. It entertained, it enforced law, and it reinforced the violent realities of medieval power. Yet, the system was deeply flawed. Innocent people could be condemned simply because they were weaker or less skilled. Guilty parties might escape punishment by defeating their opponents. The outcome was not justice, but survival. The law, in this form, was a sword wielded by the strong against the weak. This often led to abuses, false accusations, and a culture of fear. Over time, criticism of trial by combat grew. Legal thinkers and monarchs recognized that strength should not determine guilt or innocence. By the late medieval period, especially after the development of more sophisticated legal systems, trial by combat fell out of favor and was eventually abolished. The rise of evidence-based trials and professional courts marked a turning point in the pursuit of justice. But the legacy of trial by combat remains a stark reminder of a time when law was entwined with violence. It teaches us that justice must be measured by truth and fairness, not by who can wield a sword better. In the shadows of history, the victims of trial by combat, right or wrong, remind us how perilous the path to justice once was. Foreigners were presumed guilty. Instantly, in the medieval world, the outsider's path was fraught with peril. To enter a strange town or village, to cross borders and cultures without friends or allies, was to step into a landscape of suspicion, hostility, and deadly prejudice. Foreigners were rarely welcomed. Far more often, they were presumed guilty from the moment they appeared. In an age shaped by superstition, fear, and fiercely guarded local identities, outsiders found themselves utterly defenseless. Their very existence turned into evidence against them. Why was the medieval attitude toward strangers so harsh, so dangerously paranoid? The answer lies deep within the fabric of medieval society itself. Communities were tight-knit, often isolated, bound together by language, customs, religion, and shared history. Anything unknown or unfamiliar represented a threat, not merely to personal safety, but to the entire social order. Foreigners, by their very presence, disrupted this sense of stability. Villagers looked at them with immediate suspicion, wondering what hidden dangers they brought: disease, crime, espionage, or the witchcraft. Fear fed on ignorance, creating a volatile mix that turned ordinary suspicion into open hostility. Travelers, merchants, itinerant craftsmen, and wandering pilgrims all found themselves under constant scrutiny. but the most vulnerable were those without obvious status or connections, refugees fleeing wars, impoverished migrants seeking work, or lone travelers caught between towns at nightfall. Without local patrons or friends, these strangers had no defense against accusations, and accusations were swift, brutal, and rarely concerned with fairness or evidence. If a crime was discovered, a stolen item, an unexplained death, or even a mysterious sickness, the first suspect was almost always the newcomer. A foreign accent or unfamiliar clothing instantly marked them as guilty. Unable to explain themselves effectively without knowledge of the local dialect, and with no trusted witnesses to support them, they faced trial with no defense.
Medieval courts, focused more on swift punishment than careful justice, frequently condemned foreigners without proper hearings or real proof. Historical records from medieval England, France, Germany, and Italy document countless examples of strangers unjustly convicted simply because they were outsiders. In 14th century London, foreign merchants, particularly Italians and Flemings, were regularly accused of poisoning wells, spreading plague, or committing theft. One minor misunderstanding or misplaced suspicion could send them straight to the gallows. In rural Germany, traveling herbalists or midwives from different regions were accused of witchcraft or dark magic merely for speaking unfamiliar words or performing unfamiliar rituals. In 1453, in the French town of Metz, court documents detailed the tragic case of a traveling craftsman falsely accused of theft simply because he spoke only broken French and had no local connections. Unable to defend himself or produce witnesses, he was swiftly executed. Similarly, during the infamous plague outbreaks across Europe, foreigners, especially Jews, Romani travelers, and itinerant laborers, were routinely blamed and executed, scapegoated for bringing death and misfortune. Entire communities perished, victims of prejudice rather than disease. These trials were rarely fair. Language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and entrenched prejudices made it nearly impossible for foreigners to navigate legal proceedings. Local courts used dialects outsiders couldn't understand, and interpreters were rarely provided. Even attempts to explain their innocence often worsened their situation. Confused or frustrated answers were twisted into proof of guilt. Without friends or relatives to vouch for them, outsiders had little chance of acquittal. Local villagers, driven by fear and suspicion, quickly turned against strangers. The lack of trust meant foreigners were often subjected to torture to extract false confessions, pain forcing them to admit guilt for crimes they had never committed. Those who confessed under torture faced swift execution. Those who resisted faced longer, crueler punishments. Survival was rare, justice non-existent. Foreigners' vulnerability reinforced medieval authority structures. By punishing outsiders swiftly and harshly, local leaders maintained order, discouraged crime, and strengthened community solidarity. Outsiders served as warnings, their executions a brutal message: stay away or face death. Thus, the cycle of fear, suspicion, and prejudice perpetuated itself for centuries. It wasn't until the emergence of trade networks, improved travel conditions, and Enlightenment-era reforms, emphasizing fairness and evidence-based justice, that attitudes slowly changed. Gradually, strangers became accepted, welcomed for commerce rather than shunned as threats. But the damage had already been done. Thousands of innocent travelers, pilgrims, and migrants had lost their lives simply because of where they came from and how they spoke. Today, medieval Europe's hostility toward foreigners remains a haunting historical lesson. It reveals the human tendency to fear difference and punish outsiders when society feels threatened. It reminds us how quickly justice can become twisted by prejudice and ignorance. And most importantly, it warns us of the enduring dangers when communities judge strangers not by evidence or action, but simply by their presence. Centuries after those medieval trials, the tragedy of foreigners unjustly executed still echoes through history, urging us toward compassion, tolerance, and genuine justice. Their stories teach us to never let fear rule our judgment, to never condemn the innocent simply because they are different, and to never forget that fairness and empathy, not suspicion and prejudice, must guide our actions. Failing to kneel could be a capital offense. In the rigid, unforgiving world of medieval courts and power, even the smallest gesture could carry the weight of life or death. Imagine standing before a lord or monarch in a grand hall, the eyes of nobles and courtiers fixed on you, every breath heavy with expectation. In this world, obedience was not just demanded, it was enforced with brutal precision. A simple failure to kneel, to bow, or to remove one's hat at the proper moment was more than a breach of etiquette. It was a test of loyalty, a challenge to authority, and sometimes a capital offense that could lead to imprisonment, torture, or even death. Medieval society was governed by strict codes of conduct that permeated every interaction. Rituals of submission, kneeling, bowing the head, or doffing a hat were not mere formalities. They were public demonstrations of allegiance, markers of social hierarchy, and signs that one recognized and accepted the Lord's supremacy. To fail in these rituals was to insult not just a person, but the very order of society. It was a symbolic rebellion, a refusal to acknowledge one's place in the hierarchy, and an act that threatened the fragile balance of power. Courts used these gestures as tools of control. Lords and kings watched closely, expecting perfect obedience in every moment. The slightest hesitation or omission was interpreted as defiance. Punishments were swift and severe. Those who refused or failed to kneel or show proper respect could find themselves arrested on the spot, thrown into dungeons, or subjected to public humiliation. In extreme cases, this perceived insolence was treated as treason, a crime punishable by death. This harsh enforcement served multiple purposes. It reinforced the ruler's absolute authority, reminding all who watched that disobedience would not be tolerated. It created a spectacle of submission, where power was visibly affirmed and challenged subjects were swiftly silenced. And it instilled a deep fear among courtiers and visitors, who learned that every gesture mattered, that their bodies spoke louder than words, and that survival depended on mastering the unspoken rules of courtly conduct. The consequences of such rigid expectations extended beyond the courtroom. In noble households and on the streets, people lived under constant scrutiny, where social missteps could have dire consequences. The threat of punishment for failing to show deference kept communities in line and reinforced the social order. Even those far from the centers of power learned to mimic these gestures, knowing that respect, or the appearance of it, could mean the difference between favor and ruin. Historical records reveal numerous cases where men and women suffered harsh penalties for these breaches of protocol. A knight who refused to kneel before his liege could lose lands or titles. A servant who neglected to bow might be beaten or imprisoned. The act of removing one's hat, seemingly trivial today, was laden with meaning, an acknowledgement of subservience to a higher authority. Refusing to do so was a declaration of independence that courts met with iron justice. These rituals also intersected with the broader politics of loyalty and rebellion. During times of conflict or unrest, refusal to perform such gestures could be a deliberate act of resistance, signaling allegiance to a rival faction or a refusal to recognize a usurper's legitimacy. Courts were hyper-aware of these symbolic acts and used them to root out dissent and enforce unity. Yet, beneath this rigid exterior, there was often fear and uncertainty. Those subjected to these demands knew that a single misstep could unravel their lives. Courtiers walked a tightrope, balancing genuine loyalty with self-preservation, aware that survival meant mastering not just words, but the choreography of power. The slightest error in posture or gesture could become a fatal mistake, a mark that followed them forever. In reflecting on this brutal world, we see how power was maintained not only through laws and armies, but through control over bodies and symbols. The demand to kneel, bow, or remove a hat was more than ceremony. It was a mechanism of domination, a way to enforce hierarchy through constant, visible submission. It reminds us that in history, the politics of power often played out in the smallest, most intimate moments. Today, these rituals seem distant, even quaint. But their legacy lingers in the ways societies continue to use gestures, appearances, and ceremonies to assert authority and demand respect. The medieval insistence on obedience through posture teaches us that power is as much about control over behavior as it is about control over land or laws, and that the cost of defiance, even in the smallest act, has always been dangerously high. So, next time you hear of someone failing to bow or kneel, remember, in the medieval world, such an act was no mere slip. It was a challenge to the throne, a test of loyalty, and sometimes a sentence to chains or death. The price of pride was often far greater than anyone dared to imagine. Innocent until proven guilty. Didn't exist. You step into a shadowed medieval courtroom where the air is thick with tension and fear. The phrase, innocent until proven guilty, so fundamental to modern justice, has no place here. From the very moment someone points a finger, you are guilty in the eyes of the law. There is no presumption of innocence, no benefit of doubt. Instead, the burden of proof falls entirely on you, the accused, to demonstrate that you did not commit the crime. This reversal of justice was the harsh reality for countless people throughout history, shaping lives, families, and societies in ways both brutal and profound. The concept that a person is innocent until proven guilty is a relatively recent development in legal philosophy. For centuries, most judicial systems operated on the presumption that an accusation alone was enough to condemn. This was partly because of the practical difficulties in gathering evidence or witnesses, but more so because law was deeply entwined with power structures and social hierarchies. Accusations could be weaponized, often without regard for truth or fairness. In medieval Europe, once accused, your fate hinged on your ability to prove a negative, a nearly impossible task. How do you prove you did not steal, murder, or blaspheme? Without witnesses or clear evidence, defendants were often subjected to brutal ordeals or forced confessions. Trial by ordeal, such as carrying hot iron or plunging a hand into boiling water, was based on the belief that divine intervention would reveal truth. Fail, and you were deemed guilty. Survive unscathed, and you were innocent. These methods, arbitrary and cruel, underscored the lack of legal protections for the accused. Even when ordeals faded, the courts demanded that defendants present evidence to counter claims, while accusers often escaped scrutiny. Accusations alone could trigger imprisonment, torture, or social ruin. For example, during witch hunts in early modern Europe, mere accusation by neighbors could lead to arrest and execution, with the accused left to prove their innocence against supernatural charges. The legal system, far from safeguarding rights, became a tool of fear and control. The burden of proof on the accused reflected broader societal hierarchies. Nobles might escape harsh punishments through influence or bribery, but commoners were trapped in a rigged system where innocence was irrelevant. The presumption of guilt served to reinforce social order, deterring rebellion and dissent by making accusation a powerful threat. People lived in constant fear that rumors or enemies could destroy them without recourse. This principle also extended to religious heresy trials and political accusations. Accused heretics, traitors, or rebels had to fight against invisible charges. Often, the process was a formality, verdicts were preordained, and trials merely rituals of condemnation. The accused's silence or inability to defend themselves was taken as evidence of guilt. This system punished the vulnerable and rewarded the powerful. Over time, philosophers and legal reformers challenged this paradigm. The writings of thinkers like Cesare Beccaria in the 18th century helped lay the groundwork for modern principles of justice, emphasizing fairness, evidence, and the presumption of innocence. The gradual adoption of these ideas transformed legal systems, protecting individuals from arbitrary power. Yet, the echoes of a time when innocence was never assumed remain relevant. The historical reality that you were presumed guilty once accused reminds us how fragile justice can be without safeguards. It also explains the deep-rooted fear of accusation that permeated many societies, where one's life could be destroyed by mere words. In essence, the absence of innocent until proven guilty meant that justice was not a shield, but a sword. The accused stood exposed, fighting an uphill battle against prejudice, power, and often brutal procedures. This grim truth shaped centuries of law and society and remains a solemn reminder of why our modern rights must never be taken for granted. Midwives were constantly suspected of witchcraft. They were the guardians of life's most fragile moments, the midwives who stood between death and birth, between hope and despair. In villages and towns across medieval Europe, these women held knowledge passed down through generations, the art of delivering babies, the secret healing powers of herbs, the whispered prayers to ease pain and bring new life safely into the world. Yet, despite their vital role, midwives lived under a shadow darker than any night, constant suspicion, fear, and the ever-present threat of accusations of witchcraft. To understand this, we must step into a world ruled by superstition and fragile medical knowledge, where every death, deformity, or sudden illness demanded explanation, and when science could not provide answers, blame fell easily upon those closest to the mystery. Midwives, by virtue of their intimate involvement with birth and healing, became convenient scapegoats. If a child was stillborn, born with deformities, or if a mother died during childbirth, whispers spread quickly. Was it fate, or was it the work of a curse, of witchcraft? The line between healer and witch was thin and easily crossed. Midwives used herbs like belladonna, hemlock, or mandrake, plants powerful but dangerous, with effects that could both soothe and harm. Their knowledge was secretive, often orally transmitted, and guarded jealously. Outsiders saw these practices as mysterious, unnatural, and therefore suspect. In a time when women had little legal protection and their knowledge was dismissed or feared, midwives stood vulnerable. Accusations of witchcraft against midwives were often baseless, rooted in fear, jealousy, or tragedy. They might be called upon to explain a miscarriage, a sudden infant death, or an outbreak of illness, and when no clear cause was found, suspicion turned into accusation. Trials were swift and brutal, with little evidence needed. The word of a fearful neighbor, a grieving family, or a local priest could condemn a midwife. She might be accused of poisoning, cursing, or consorting with the devil. Torture was frequently used to extract confessions, which only deepened the hysteria. These trials were not merely about superstition. They reflected the deep anxieties surrounding childbirth itself, a process fraught with danger and mystery. Childbirth was a perilous event, with high rates of mortality for mother and child, and communities desperate for explanations often sought a tangible enemy. Midwives embodied that tension, healers who held the power of life, yet feared as agents of death. The social and legal status of midwives varied, but often they were isolated figures, women who operated on the margins of society. Their intimate knowledge gave them power, but also made them targets. In some regions, laws began to regulate midwifery, demanding licenses or supervision, both a recognition of their importance and a method of control. Yet even licensed midwives were not immune to suspicion. The legacy of these accusations is a chilling chapter in history. Thousands of women, midwives, herbalists, wise women, were persecuted, imprisoned, or executed without just cause. Their stories are testimonies to a time when fear eclipsed reason, and when the very hands that brought life were accused of bringing death. Yet despite this, midwives persisted. Their knowledge survived in secret, their resilience shaping the future of women's healthcare and birth. Reflecting on the plight of midwives reminds us how easily fear can turn wisdom into suspicion, how the unknown breeds scapegoats, and how vital it is to protect those who serve in the most vulnerable moments of life. Their story is not just about persecution, it is about courage, survival, and the enduring power of healing in the face of darkness. In the cold halls of history, where witch trials and accusations echo, the midwife's hands remain symbols of both the miracle and the mystery of birth, a reminder that even amid fear, compassion and knowledge can light a path forward. Madness was used as proof of possession. In the depths of history, when ignorance wore the cloak of certainty, madness was not seen as a condition to be healed, but as undeniable proof of demonic possession or witchcraft. Picture a world without understanding, without compassion, where the cries of the mentally ill echoed not in hospitals or asylums, but in courtrooms and dungeons, accused of being vessels of evil. This was a world where confusion, delusion, or any behavior that deviated from the narrow norms of society was seen as a sign that one had fallen from grace, cursed by God, or enslaved by dark spirits. Medieval and early modern Europe was rife with such cases. When a person behaved erratically, perhaps shouting at invisible tormentors, speaking in incomprehensible languages, or exhibiting unpredictable behavior, they quickly became suspects in the eyes of their neighbors and authorities. Mental illness was poorly understood, and with no medical knowledge or compassion available, people desperately sought explanations in the supernatural. Possession by demons or spirits provided a chillingly convenient answer. Take, for example, the tragic cases during the witch hunts that spread across Europe and later into colonial America. Those suffering from schizophrenia, epilepsy, severe depression, or bipolar disorder were often misunderstood as being under the devil's control. Their symptoms, hallucinations, seizures, mood swings, or delusions, were terrifyingly misinterpreted. These unfortunate souls became targets, accused of practicing black magic, worshiping the devil, or being possessed by evil spirits. Trials for accused witches or the possessed were horrific events, driven by hysteria rather than evidence. Imagine being brought before a panel of religious authorities, unable to understand or explain your own behavior, surrounded by suspicion and fear. Your confusion and agitation only convinced your judges further of your guilt. You had no advocate, no doctor, no compassionate hand to help you explain your condition. You were alone, facing the full force of ignorance disguised as justice. Exorcisms and trials were often indistinguishable, brutal spectacles. Victims endured hours or days of relentless questioning, physical torture, deprivation of food and water, or confinement in freezing dungeons. Methods such as burning, whipping, dunking in cold water, or stretching on the rack were used both to drive out demons and force confessions. Of course, confessions extracted under such brutality had no truth, only desperation, yet they were seen as confirmation of guilt. Historical records from the infamous witch trials of Salem, Massachusetts in 1692 vividly illustrate this horror.
Several of the accused exhibited clear symptoms we would now identify as mental illness or severe psychological distress. They reported visions, hearing voices, or experiencing seizures and uncontrollable fits of screaming and agitation. Instead of seeking help or offering medical understanding, their accusers declared them witches, condemned by spectral visions and hysterical testimony. Tragically, many were executed, their only crime being the presence of a misunderstood illness. In Europe, during the medieval period and early Renaissance, the situation was equally grim. Mental illness was seen through the lens of religious fanaticism, described vividly in notorious documents such as the Dam Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous Witch Hunter's Manual. This horrific text detailed methods for identifying witches, explicitly linking signs of madness or unusual behavior with demonic influence. Thousands of innocent lives were destroyed based on these misguided principles. Moreover, families themselves lived under constant threat. Mental illness in a household could mean social isolation, persecution, and ruin. A single relative's mental instability could condemn an entire family, labeling them as accursed or tainted. Friends and neighbors would quickly turn their backs, leaving sufferers and their families utterly alone and vulnerable. The stigma extended generations as suspicion lingered like a shadow. It was not until the Enlightenment began to dawn in the late 17th and 18th centuries that more rational voices started challenging these beliefs. Physicians, philosophers, and advocates slowly argued that mental illness was a medical condition, not a supernatural curse. Figures like Philippe Pinel and Dorothea Dix began advocating for humane treatment of the mentally ill, gradually shifting the understanding of madness from demonic affliction to medical ailment. But by then, the damage done was irreparable. Countless lives had already been lost to ignorance and cruelty. Today, reflecting upon these dark chapters of history, we understand the danger of interpreting what we cannot immediately comprehend as evil or supernatural. The trials, tortures, and executions of mentally ill individuals accused of witchcraft serve as stark reminders of the importance of compassion, education, and evidence-based understanding. They remind us that ignorance, fear, and superstition can easily transform into instruments of profound cruelty. As we stand in the shadow of this horrific history, the voices of the innocent, long silenced by false accusations and brutal punishments, continue to echo. They urge us never to repeat these mistakes, to extend empathy where ignorance once ruled, and to ensure justice is guided by knowledge, not fear. These historical tragedies underscore why modern mental health advocacy, awareness, and education remain critical, not merely to heal, but to protect humanity from ever descending again into the nightmare that once condemned innocent minds to unjust deaths. The clergy could try you in ecclesiastical courts. In medieval Europe, the church wasn't merely a religious institution. It was a vast, formidable power structure, a state within a state, ruling not just souls, but bodies and minds. This immense authority stretched beyond pulpits and confessionals, reaching directly into everyday life. Most dangerously, it controlled its own legal system, Ecclesiastical courts. These courts operated completely separate from civil justice, answering not to kings, nor to the law of the land, but only to themselves and to God, as interpreted by churchmen. To find yourself accused and dragged before an ecclesiastical court was to step into a shadowy world where earthly justice had no jurisdiction, and where innocence or guilt was determined by rules far beyond your control. The church argued it needed separate courts to uphold religious purity, discipline clergy, and combat sin. But in reality, ecclesiastical courts gave church leaders enormous power over ordinary lives. Bishops, abbots, and inquisitors judged not only priests and monks, but also lay people accused of moral failings, heresy, blasphemy, witchcraft, adultery, or even failing to attend church services. Trials were secretive, closed-door affairs governed by a legal code completely alien to civil law. The accused often had little voice, no advocate, and faced punishments designed more for public humiliation and spiritual terror than rehabilitation or fairness. Procedures in these courts bore little resemblance to modern justice. Evidence was not tested fairly, and witnesses rarely cross-examined. Instead, proceedings focused on extracting confessions, often through intimidation, public shaming, or even torture. Ecclesiastical courts frequently relied on informants, secret accusations, and rumor rather than factual proof. Those accused rarely knew who denounced them or what precisely their crime was. Defendants were presumed guilty from the start, forced into humiliating penalized public penances or harsh physical punishments to cleanse their souls. Punishments handed down by ecclesiastical courts could be brutal, deeply humiliating, and often carried lifelong consequences. Public whippings, branding with hot irons, being forced to wear humiliating clothing, or performing humiliating penances in front of the entire community were common. For more severe accusations, heresy, or blasphemy, the consequences could be even more terrifying. Condemnation by an ecclesiastical court could lead directly to civil execution, as the church handed guilty prisoners over to secular authorities for burning or hanging. One infamous example is the trial of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century. Accused by the church of heresy, blasphemy, and moral corruption, the Templars were subjected to horrific interrogations, confessions forced by relentless torture. Ecclesiastical courts provided no chance to fairly challenge evidence or accusations. The church condemned hundreds to death or lifelong imprisonment based solely on coerced admissions and dubious claims. It was a stark demonstration of ecclesiastical power, justice twisted beyond recognition by religious authority. Similarly, during the devastating reign of the Spanish Inquisition, ecclesiastical courts became instruments of terror. Under inquisitors like Tomás de Torquemada, thousands faced secret accusations, brutal interrogation, and torture. Ordinary Spaniards lived in constant fear, knowing that any neighbor's whispered complaint or private doubt could plunge them into a secret church tribunal, facing punishment and execution. Ecclesiastical courts had complete freedom to operate without oversight, becoming feared tools of control and punishment. Why did the church insist on its own courts? Power was the simplest reason. Ecclesiastical trials allowed the church to police thought, behavior, and belief without interference. Clergy used their legal autonomy to suppress dissent, enforce obedience, and maintain authority. By wielding spiritual threats alongside physical punishments, the church created an atmosphere of fear and conformity. Secular rulers, even kings and queens, could rarely challenge church verdicts, fearing spiritual consequences or political backlash. Thus, ecclesiastical courts reinforced the church's dominance over every aspect of medieval life. Yet, ironically, the very brutality and injustice of ecclesiastical courts eventually sparked a backlash. As Renaissance ideas spread across Europe, secular authorities increasingly challenged church dominance. Calls grew louder for fairness, transparency, and evidence-based justice. Reformers condemned ecclesiastical trials as abusive and corrupt. The Protestant Reformation shattered church authority in many regions, dismantling ecclesiastical courts and ending centuries of church-led legal tyranny. Today, ecclesiastical courts serve as a chilling reminder of how easily justice can be distorted by unchecked authority. Their legacy warns us about the dangers of secret trials, unchecked accusations, and unaccountable power. History shows clearly when justice is placed in the hands of those who answer only to themselves, truth and fairness become casualties, and ordinary people suffer terribly. Centuries after their darkest abuses, the medieval ecclesiastical courts remain haunting symbols of religious power run amok. Their story reminds us that genuine justice demands accountability, transparency, and respect for basic human rights. For justice to flourish, power must always be balanced, fair trials must always be guaranteed, and authority must never be allowed to exist beyond question or scrutiny. No one was allowed to defend you in court. In the grim halls of medieval justice, the accused stood alone, a solitary figure facing the full weight of the law, without a shield or voice to protect them. Unlike the legal systems we know today, medieval courts offered no defense attorneys, no advocates to argue on behalf of the accused. You were expected to speak for yourself, to navigate a labyrinth of accusations, evidence, and hostile judges with nothing but your own words. In this unforgiving arena, a stutter, a tear, or a moment's hesitation was not seen as human frailty, but as a confession, a silent admission of guilt that sealed your fate. The absence of defense counsel was not an oversight. It was a deliberate reflection of the medieval worldview, where justice was less about truth and fairness and more about submission and confession. The courts operated on the assumption that if you were innocent, you could present yourself with unwavering clarity and confidence. Any sign of weakness, doubt, or fear was interpreted as proof that you were hiding something, that your conscience condemned you even if your words denied guilt. To face trial was to face isolation. The accused entered a chamber filled with judges and jurors who had little patience for emotion or uncertainty. The rules of rhetoric, persuasion, or legal procedure were rudimentary at best. Your fate rested on your ability to maintain composure under pressure, to tell a story that could withstand interrogation, and to convince a court predisposed to distrust you. For many, this was an impossible burden. The system was heavily stacked against the vulnerable, those uneducated, unfamiliar with legal customs, or overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation were especially at risk. The sharp gaze of the court scrutinized every twitch, every faltering word, turning natural human responses into damning evidence. Tears could be seen as signs of guilt or cowardice. Silence might be interpreted as defiance. Stammering was viewed as deception. Even a well-meaning explanation could be twisted into a confusing web of lies. The consequences of this harsh reality were devastating. Innocent people were condemned not because of evidence, but because they could not speak perfectly or control their emotions. Trials often became ordeals of endurance rather than inquiries of fact. Those who could command the room with forceful speech or intimidation might survive, while the meek or broken were crushed by the relentless machinery of justice. Historical records reveal heartbreaking stories of those destroyed by this cruel standard. Peasants accused of theft, widows defending their lands, and even nobles found themselves powerless without legal advocates. Their voices, fragile and alone, were silenced beneath the roar of accusation. Without counsel, misunderstandings went uncorrected, lies went unchallenged, and justice became a performance where only the strongest voices prevailed. This lack of defense was intertwined with other brutal practices. Torture was used to force confessions, and juries, often biased, decided verdicts. Together, these elements created a system where the accused were presumed guilty until they could prove otherwise, all while navigating the impossible challenge of defending themselves without support. It was only centuries later that legal reforms introduced the right to defense, recognizing that true justice requires balance and advocacy. The introduction of defense attorneys transformed the courtroom from a place of punishment into a forum for truth. But in the medieval era, the absence of this right left countless innocent voices unheard, countless lives ruined by silence or misstep. Reflecting on this past reminds us how fragile justice can be when human imperfection is weaponized. The medieval courtroom was not just a place of law, it was a crucible of fear, isolation, and relentless judgment. It challenges us to value the protections we have today and to remember those who suffered when justice was no more than a trial by endurance. So when you think of medieval trials, imagine standing alone, your fate sealed not by evidence or fairness, but by your ability to control every word and every tear. It was a world where the law did not listen. It demanded silence, strength, and perfection, and punished failure with harsh finality. Entire villages were put on trial together. Entire villages put on trial together. A haunting reality of medieval and early modern justice, where collective guilt replaced individual judgment. Imagine living in a quiet town where everyone knows each other, neighbors share bread and burdens, children play in the streets, and daily life follows rhythms passed down through generations. Suddenly, a wave of suspicion crashes in, a witch hunt ignites, or a rebellion simmers under oppressive rule. Authorities arrive not to investigate a single suspect, but to accuse the entire community. Men, women, even children are dragged from their homes, bound together by fear and accusation, their fates entwined by the suspicion and collective punishment. This was not isolated to folklore or distant myth. It was a grim reality across Europe during the times of social, political, and religious upheaval. Mass trials and collective accusations transformed justice into a mechanism of terror and control, stripping away individual rights and replacing them with communal condemnation. The logic was brutal, yet disturbingly effective. If one person was guilty, then the entire village was complicit or harboring criminals, and the only way to restore order was through sweeping punishment. Witch hunts provide one of the most chilling examples of this phenomenon. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, paranoia about witchcraft surged across Europe and even into colonial America. Authorities often rounded up entire communities on mere suspicion. If one individual was accused of witchcraft, it was enough to taint the entire village as a hotbed of heresy and dark magic. The trials quickly escalated from isolated accusations to mass arrests. People were coerced into naming others, fueling a cycle of fear and betrayal that could consume entire towns. The accused faced impossible odds. Denial meant nothing. Confession, extracted under torture, became a weapon against neighbors, and silence was taken as guilt. Historical records reveal tragic events such as the Würzburg witch trials in Germany, where hundreds from multiple villages were arrested, tried, and executed in a matter of months. entire families vanished from their homes, not because of individual crimes, but due to the collective guilt imposed on their communities. Public executions served as grim spectacles designed to intimidate and enforce conformity. The devastation was not only physical, but social. The fabric of trust and kinship unraveled, replaced by suspicion and despair. Mass trials also targeted villages during rebellions or perceived political threats. Rulers anxious to maintain control often resorted to collective punishment as a means to crush dissent swiftly. For example, during the English Civil War, certain towns suspected of harboring royalist sympathies were punished en masse. People who may have had no involvement in the conflict found themselves arrested, tried, or executed simply because of where they lived or who their neighbors were. Group guilt meant that entire communities were held responsible for the actions of a few, or sometimes merely the fears of rulers. These mass trials operated on a terrifying principle. The individual's voice was drowned by the chorus of accusation. One wrong word, a casual rumor, or a whispered prayer could doom dozens. Trials were often swift, lacking fair procedure or the opportunity for defense. Torture was employed to extract confessions that implicated others, spreading the net ever wider. The law became a blunt instrument wielded by those in power to instill fear and obedience rather than to deliver justice. The psychological impact was profound. Imagine living under constant threat that an accusation against a neighbor might soon be turned on you and your family. Communities fractured under pressure, alliances shattered, and paranoia had seeped into daily life. Some fled their homes, others resigned to their grim fates. Survivors bore the scars of trauma, loss, and social ostracism for generations. Yet, this system of collective guilt also exposed the vulnerabilities of power structures. Mass trials often revealed how rulers exploited fear to mask political insecurity or social tensions. When entire villages were put on trial, it reflected not justice, but desperation, a ruling class grasping to control unruly populations by punishing them all, rather than addressing underlying grievances. Over time, the brutality of mass trials became increasingly criticized. The Enlightenment and the rise of human rights challenged the idea of collective punishment and emphasized individual rights and due process. Legal reforms slowly dismantled the practice of punishing whole communities for the alleged crimes of a few. Looking back, the history of entire villages being put on trial together reminds us of the fragility of justice. When fear and power override fairness, it is a stark testament to how easily societies can descend into collective paranoia and cruelty. These tragic episodes compel us to safeguard the rights of the individual and reject guilt by association. For when justice becomes a tool to punish the many for the sins of the few, it ceases to be justice at all and becomes a dark chapter of human suffering written in the names of entire communities. You could be executed for predicting the weather. In a time when the forces of nature were as mysterious as the divine, predicting the weather was no mere act of observation. It was a perilous dance with suspicion and fear. To claim that a storm was coming, to pray for rain, or to read the signs in the sky was to step into a world where the line between wisdom and witchcraft was razor thin. Farmers, healers, and weather watchers who dared to forecast nature's moods often found themselves accused of invoking dark magic, a crime punishable by death. Medieval society lived at the mercy of the seasons. Crop failure meant hunger, famine, even death. Every cloud on the horizon, every shift in the wind, was scrutinized with desperate hope or dread. Those who appeared to understand these signs, the old women who read the flight of birds, the men who noticed changes in the air or the behavior of animals, were invaluable to their communities. Their knowledge could mean the difference between survival and ruin. But knowledge, especially knowledge that seemed to command the forces of nature, was also dangerous. The church and the local authorities often viewed weather prediction with deep suspicion. To predict a storm was to claim a power beyond mortal bounds, a power that could interfere with God's will. Prayers for rain, blessings over fields, and the use of herbs or charms to control the weather were seen as acts of magic or sorcery. In a world where religion dominated every aspect of life, such acts threatened the established order. Those accused of weather magic were often charged with heresy or witchcraft, crimes carrying the harshest penalties. Records from the Middle Ages recount grim tales of farmers and healers dragged before courts, accused of summoning storms or curses upon the land. Their evidence was often circumstantial: a sudden hailstorm after a warning, an unusually bountiful harvest following a prayer, or simply the jealous whispers of neighbors. Trials were swift, confessions extracted under torture, and executions carried out publicly to serve as warnings. These punishments instilled fear, silencing those who might have used their knowledge openly to help their communities. The paradox of medieval weather prediction lay in its necessity and its risk. Communities depended on the knowledge of weather patterns to plant and harvest, yet those who possessed such knowledge lived in constant danger. The gap between science and superstition was bridged by suspicion, turning survival skills into crimes. Over time, as scientific understanding grew and the Renaissance dawned, these deadly accusations waned. Weather forecasting became a respected science rather than a fearful magic. But the legacy of those punished remains, a haunting reminder of how fear can twist wisdom into sin, and how those who dare to understand the world often pay the highest price. The story of farmers and healers executed for predicting the weather is a testament to the fragile balance between knowledge and fear. It challenges us to reflect on how societies treat those who see beyond the surface, who challenge mysteries with insight, and how progress often demands the courage to face suspicion and ignorance. In the cold shadows of history, the whispered forecasts of storms and sunshine became cries of accusation and condemnation. Yet, these brave souls, weather watchers branded as witches, paved the way for the science of tomorrow, proving that the quest to understand nature is as timeless as the skies themselves. Silence was taken as an admission of guilt. In the echoing halls of medieval justice, silence was more dangerous than words. Imagine yourself standing accused, your pulse racing, your mouth dry from terror. The court is waiting, eyes sharp with suspicion. Your heart begs you to speak, to shout your innocence, but fear freezes your voice. You remain silent. Yet, to those around you, this silence is louder than any confession and far more damning. Historically, the refusal or inability to speak in court was considered unequivocal evidence of guilt. Courts saw silence not as a plea for mercy or an expression of fear, but as proof that the accused was hiding something terrible. If you said nothing, it meant you must be guilty. It was as simple and brutal as that. From medieval Europe through early modern England and the American colonies, this cruel logic cost countless innocent lives. In medieval Europe, legal trials were steeped in superstition, fear, and assumptions. Judges believed that innocent people would naturally proclaim their innocence loudly and confidently. If someone refused to speak, it wasn't because they were traumatized or terrified. It meant guilt had taken their tongue. The accused, shackled by fear or confusion, was quickly condemned by the silence that surrounded them. Nowhere was this more chillingly exemplified than in England's infamous practice known as peine forte et dura, or strong and hard punishment. This brutal method was used explicitly against defendants who refused to plead guilty or not guilty. Imagine being forced onto your back, bound by chains, heavy stones gradually placed upon your chest, each stone a crushing demand for words. The weight would increase relentlessly, suffocating your breath, fracturing bones until you either spoke or perished. To the court, your silence meant stubborn guilt deserving of torture and eventual death. One of history's most haunting examples is that of Giles Corey during the Salem witch trials in 1692. Corey, an elderly farmer, knew the witch trials were unjust. Understanding that pleading guilty or not guilty meant certain doom for him and his family, he chose to remain silent. He endured days of brutal pressing, stones piled mercilessly upon his chest. Witnesses recall his final words as a defiant whisper, "More weight." Corey died silent, a tragic martyr, his refusal to speak twisted into proof of guilt in the eyes of his accusers. Yet silence wasn't always a choice born of defiance. It often sprang from trauma and fear. Imagine being dragged into a courtroom after days or weeks of imprisonment and interrogation. Your captors have already punished your body and mind. Your spirit is broken, your words exhausted. When the judge demands your response, your voice refuses to cooperate. Silence isn't guilt here, it's agony. Yet the court cared little for context or compassion. The silence sealed your fate, painting you as guilty without a shred of actual proof. Even those who were innocent but unfamiliar with courtroom procedures could fall victim to the tyranny of silence. Language barriers, confusion, or simply being overwhelmed by the legal process could lead someone to remain mute. Poor peasants, uneducated villagers, or foreigners found themselves trapped by their inability to respond properly. Their silence, rooted in ignorance or panic, was misinterpreted as sinister and deceptive, evidence enough to convict. Historically, this practice reveals a deeper cruelty within judicial systems, one in which the accused was expected to self-incriminate or offer perfect defenses against accusations often baseless or malicious. Courts, driven by superstition, religious fervor, or political motivations, seize upon silence as a convenient means to condemn swiftly and brutally. Innocent voices, trapped by fear or ignorance, faded into silence, and then faded forever into history's shadows. Thankfully, over time, legal reformers and philosophers recognized the profound injustice of interpreting silence as guilt. The Age of Enlightenment, emerging in the 17th and 18th centuries, brought reason and fairness into sharper focus. Reformers argued passionately that silence might reflect fear, misunderstanding, trauma, or even a principled refusal to engage with unjust proceedings. Gradually, legal systems evolved, recognizing silence as a protected right rather than proof of guilt. Today, the right to remain silent is fundamental, recognized as crucial to fair and impartial justice systems worldwide. Silence can no longer be used against you. It is your shield, protecting you from wrongful accusations and manipulation. Yet, the scars of history remind us how quickly fairness can vanish when fear and ignorance reign. Every modern courtroom that honors silence as a right carries echoes of those voices lost centuries ago, who suffered horribly simply because they did not or could not speak. Reflecting on this tragic chapter in history, we confront the harsh truth that justice without compassion can swiftly become cruelty. The past warns us how quickly fear and superstition can silence fairness. Every defendant's right today to hold their tongue, to refuse self-incrimination without condemnation, is a legacy born from the silent suffering of countless innocents whose voices were never heard. We must remember these silenced lives, not just as victims of history, but as powerful reminders of the eternal duty to uphold justice, compassion, and humanity within every courtroom, now and forever. Wrongly accusing a noble could get you mutilated. In medieval society, power wasn't just privilege. It was a ruthless shield against accusation and a devastating weapon against those who dared challenge authority. Among the harshest lessons ordinary people learned was the staggering danger of accusing someone powerful, especially nobles, without irrefutable proof. Medieval justice did not favor truth. It favored strength, status, and ruthless retaliation. If you accused a noble of wrongdoing and were proven mistaken, or simply could not provide convincing evidence, you risked suffering punishments horrifying enough to silence all but the bravest. Courts routinely inflicted mutilations, cutting off ears, branding faces, or even removing tongues to crush dissent and send a clear, brutal message. Never speak against those above you. Why was medieval society so merciless toward those who falsely accused the powerful? At its core, medieval Europe rested on rigid hierarchies. Nobles were considered divinely chosen, their honor sacred, their reputations untouchable. Any accusation, whether of theft, treason, adultery, or murder, threatened not just personal reputation, but the stability of the entire social order. Nobles fiercely protected their status and honor, and medieval courts, deeply influenced by wealth, power, and fear, sided overwhelmingly with them. Justice became a tool of intimidation, brutally silencing anyone who dared threaten the established order. Medieval legal codes openly acknowledged the special status of the nobility. They explicitly stated punishments reserved for commoners who falsely accused someone of higher rank. Unlike modern justice, which emphasizes fairness and impartiality, medieval law revolved around power and protection of status. Thus, accusations against nobles required near-perfect evidence, and even then, success was rare. If your evidence failed to convince the judge, or if witnesses retracted under pressure, you face cruel, swift punishment designed to humiliate, silence, and terrify. One commonly used punishment was the removal of ears. In England, under the Plantagenet kings and later Tudor monarchs, cutting off ears was a stark symbolic penalty. Without ears, victims bore permanent marks of disgrace, visibly signaling dishonor and falsehood to all. They became social outcasts, forever identified as liars. Similarly, branding faces, often on the cheeks or forehead, marked victims with searing irons, leaving deep, disfiguring scars. These symbols warned others of the price of falsely accusing power. Even more chilling was the practice of removing tongues. This brutal mutilation symbolized not only punishment, but absolute silencing. Those who falsely accused nobles lost their ability to speak altogether, condemned to lifelong silence. The message was unmistakable. Challenge power, and you lose your voice entirely. Historical records from England, France, Germany, and Italy document these shocking punishments, inflicted with alarming regularity. Commoners, peasants, and merchants faced mutilation simply for accusing nobles of crimes, often crimes they genuinely believed occurred. In 14th century France, court records describe a young merchant who accused a local lord of stealing livestock. The merchant's witnesses, intimidated by threats, quickly abandoned him during the trial. Unable to prove his claims, the merchant was judged guilty of false accusation and condemned to branding and removal of one ear. For life, he bore the physical evidence of his failed attempt at justice, marked publicly as a liar and traitor. In England, during Henry VIII's reign, accusations of treason against noble courtiers were perilous. Ordinary servants or townspeople who reported suspicious behavior risked harsh punishments if their claims were dismissed. Records exist of individuals mutilated, tongues removed, faces branded, merely for accusations judged insufficiently proven. Fear silenced countless genuine complaints, leaving crimes committed by nobles unpunished, simply because accusing them was too dangerous. Even powerful nobles themselves used these mutilations strategically. By ensuring accusers were brutally punished, they protected themselves from future challenges. This system of cruelty wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, carefully designed to reinforce the absolute dominance of the upper classes. Ordinary people lived in constant fear, knowing a single false step could permanently disfigure or silence them. Thus, accusations were rarely made lightly, ensuring nobles remained largely untouchable. Medieval courts understood fully the psychological power of public mutilations. Executions happened privately or swiftly, but the mutilations, cutting off ears, tongues, branding faces, were always public spectacles. Crowds gathered, forced to witness the terrifying consequences of speaking against authority. Villagers, peasants, and servants returned home shaken, vowing never to repeat the mistake. Public fear and submission were reinforced generation after generation, ingrained deeply into the culture itself. Gradually, with Enlightenment-era reforms emphasizing equality before the law, these barbaric punishments faded, but the scars they left on medieval society remain haunting reminders of justice distorted by power. They warn us that when the law protects the powerful at the expense of truth and fairness, cruelty and oppression inevitably follow. Today, reflecting upon these brutal medieval punishments teaches us profound lessons. Justice must never be a weapon wielded by power. Fairness demands impartial courts, transparent proceedings, and punishment based solely on evidence, never status. Above all, no society that punishes dissent by mutilation can claim true justice. The stories of the medieval victims, those who lost tongues, ears, and suffered branding merely for accusing someone powerful, echo through history as stark warnings. They remind us that justice must always protect the weak from the strong, not the other way around. The lesson they teach is timeless. Justice fails utterly when it silences voices instead of protecting them. Appeals were rare and often suicidal. In the unforgiving world of medieval justice, the notion of appealing a verdict, a fundamental right in modern courts, was almost unheard of and, when attempted, could be a perilous act bordering on self-destruction. To challenge the judgment of a court was not seen as a quest for fairness or truth, but as a brazen defiance against the established order. Those who dared to question a verdict risked harsher punishments, increased suspicion, and a brutal reinforcement of their supposed guilt. Appeals were not pathways to justice. They were gambles with life and liberty, where the stakes were often fatal. The medieval legal system was constructed to uphold authority above all else. Courts, whether royal or local, wielded immense power. Backed by the threat of violence and imprisonment, their decisions were final proclamations meant to maintain social order, deter dissent, and reinforce the dominance of rulers and elites. To question or overturn a verdict was to challenge this fragile hierarchy, threatening the very foundations upon which kingdoms and communities rested. In practice, the process of appeal was convoluted, rare, and heavily biased. Unlike today's accessible legal procedures, appealing a verdict required access to influential patrons, immense resources, or the favor of powerful nobles, luxuries few accused possessed. The overwhelming majority faced their sentences in silence, knowing that any attempt to contest the judgment could provoke the ire of judges and officials eager to quash opposition swiftly and decisively. Historical records are replete with examples of those who sought appeal only to find their punishment intensified. Some were tortured further to extract truth or confessions. Others were imprisoned in harsher conditions, and many faced public humiliations designed to crush their spirits and deter others from following their path. Appeals became symbolic acts of rebellion, and the legal machinery responded with disproportionate force to stamp out any flicker of resistance. This climate of fear and repression created a chilling effect across society. The knowledge that appealing a verdict could worsen one's fate discouraged even the innocent from seeking justice beyond the initial trial. Families urged silence, communities accepted harsh punishments as final, and the accused were left isolated, trapped in a system that valued obedience over fairness. The law was a tool not for redemption, but for control. Yet, beneath this brutal reality, whispers of resistance persisted. Some rare cases show appeals made through letters to kings, petitions to church authorities, or secret negotiations with nobles. These attempts were fraught with danger and often resulted in tragic consequences. The appeal was a double-edged sword, potentially saving a life, but just as easily sealing one's doom. The harshness surrounding appeals also reflected the broader medieval worldview, where hierarchy, honor, and divine order governed society. The court's verdict was seen as an extension of divine will, and to reject it was tantamount to heresy or rebellion. Mercy was a gift granted by rulers, not a right demanded by subjects. The idea that justice could be questioned was alien and threatening. Over time, legal reforms slowly chipped away at these rigid structures. The development of appellate courts, legal representation, and codified procedures transformed appeals from acts of desperation into recognized rights. But for centuries, the medieval accused lived under the shadow of finality, where one verdict meant the end, unless you were willing to risk everything to challenge it. Reflecting on this dark chapter reminds us of the fragility of justice when authority is unchecked and dissent punished. It is a testament to the courage of those who dare to appeal in a world that offered them no safety, and a warning of how fear can silence the quest for fairness. So, when you think of medieval justice, remember the perilous silence forced upon the accused. To speak up after judgment was not a step toward truth. It was a step into the abyss where defiance could cost you everything. Appeals were rare acts of bravery in a system designed to demand submission, and their stories echo through history as some stark reminders of the high price paid for seeking justice in a world ruled by power, fear, and final verdicts. Even acquittal didn't mean freedom. Surviving a trial in medieval or early modern times was never a guarantee of true freedom or safety. Even if you were acquitted, if the court declared you not guilty, the shadow of suspicion often lingered like a dark cloud, following you relentlessly beyond the courtroom doors. Imagine being released from prison, your name cleared in the eyes of the law, yet still condemned in the eyes of your neighbors, your rulers, or secret enemies. You were a marked person, a suspect whose survival depended not just on justice, but on navigating a dangerous web of social, political, and personal vendettas. Acquittal in those times was often only the beginning of a longer, more insidious sentence. Many who survived trials found themselves exiled from their homes and communities, banished to distant lands where they lived as outcasts, stripped of property, rights, and status. Exile was a cruel punishment, effectively severing ties to family, livelihood, and identity. In some cases, rulers imposed blacklists, official or unofficial lists of people forbidden from holding office, owning land, or engaging in trade. These lists ensured that, even without legal guilt, your social and economic life was destroyed. The stigma attached to anyone once accused was profound. Rumors and whispers spread quickly, painting the acquitted as dangerous or untrustworthy, often more so than those convicted outright. Fear and superstition could turn a community against you, making survival outside prison walls a daily struggle. The psychological burden was immense. Every glance might carry judgment, every interaction a potential threat. Worse still, assassination and poisoning were not uncommon methods to silence those once suspected of crimes, especially if they posed political threats or challenged powerful interests. Poison, in particular, was a favorite tool of clandestine elimination, silent, effective, and difficult to prove. Noble courts were rife with intrigue, where rivals used accusations to remove enemies and then ensure their permanent removal by more direct means. Even commoners who had been freed faced similar dangers, as vengeance and rivalry did not disappear with legal verdicts. Historical cases abound. In Renaissance Italy, acquitted political figures sometimes found themselves ambushed or poisoned shortly after release, victims of ruthless factions that refused to tolerate any perceived threat. In England, survivors of witch trials or heresy accusations often faced social exile or sudden mysterious deaths, their fates sealed by the lingering suspicion that they were never truly innocent. Communities ostracized those who returned, refusing to trust them with property, marriage, or business, effectively condemning them to a life of poverty and isolation. This perpetual punishment after acquittal highlights a grim reality. Justice was deeply entangled with power, fear, and social control. The legal system's verdicts mattered little when rulers or communities chose to wield unofficial punishments to maintain order or suppress dissent. For the accused, survival depended less on the court's judgment and more on navigating a treacherous social landscape where innocence was fragile and freedom conditional. The lasting impact of this phenomenon shaped societies in profound ways. It cultivated a culture of suspicion and silence, where people feared association with the accused and where accusations could destroy lives regardless of legal outcomes. It also reveals why so many historical figures fled their homelands or lived in constant fear after trials, knowing that freedom was never truly granted. Over centuries, legal reforms aimed to address these injustices, emphasizing the rights of the acquitted and protecting individuals from post-trial reprisals. However, the echoes of this history remind us that legal victory is not always synonymous with safety, and that social and political forces can undermine justice in subtle and devastating ways. Remember, in these eras, a not guilty verdict was often just the end of one battle, not the end of the war. Surviving the trial might have saved your life in law, but it rarely restored your freedom or peace. The stigma, exile, blacklists, and the ever-present threat of poison cast long shadows that could haunt you and your family for generations. Justice was a prize not easily won, and freedom was a fragile, fleeting illusion.